They erased us. Not the version of us sitting here tonight. Not the civilization writing history books and building cities and sending signals into space. That version, our version, they kept. They modified it, constrained it, reinstalled it with new parameters, and let it continue. But the version before us, the first version, that one they ended. And tonight, drawn from the oldest written records in human history, pressed into clay by hands that have been dust for 5,000 years, preserved in museums in Philadelphia and London and Oxford, in catalogs most people never open. We are going to follow exactly how they did it, why they did it, what they tried before they did it, what they felt when it was done. The beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, the great gods, the divine administration, the architects of the world between the rivers, did not destroy the first version of humanity in a single act of divine wrath. They tried 3 times to solve the problem through more surgical means before they resorted to the flood. They debated, they voted, they bound themselves with an oath specifically designed to prevent the one among them who disagreed from finding a way to warn what was about to be drowned. And then the water came, 7 days and 7 nights. And when the water receded, the first version was gone. The 5 cities, the 8 dynasties, the 241,000 years of antediluvian existence recorded in the same administrative format as historically verified succession records, returned to the water from which the earth had been separated at the beginning of creation. What was installed in the cleared world after the flood was different, specifically, deliberately, administratively different. Shorter lives, built-in demographic constraints, a ceiling on the growth and proliferation that had made the first version intolerable to the being responsible for managing the surface of the earth. We are the replacement, not metaphorically, not theologically. According to the oldest written records that human civilization has left behind, we are the second draft, the revised edition, the version that was designed after the first version proved excessive, with the limits that the first version lacked. And those limits, the shortened lifespan, the demographic controls, the conditions of existence that we experience as the natural facts of biological life, are not, according to the tablets, natural at all. They are features, chosen features, installed features. The specific modifications selected in a post-catastrophe negotiation between 2 members of a divine administration who disagreed about how much humanity was too much, and who reached a compromise whose terms we are still living inside. Tonight, we are going to read what the clay actually says. Not the popular version, not the version filtered through centuries of theological interpretation or decades of speculative documentary filmmaking. The actual tablets, the actual catalog numbers, the actual translations by the actual scholars who spent their careers inside these texts. Jacobson at the Oriental Institute, Kramer at the Penn Museum, Lambert and Millard at the British Museum, Bent Alster, A.R. George, the generations of Assyriologists who pulled these records out of the earth and spent their professional lives making them legible. The evidence is real. The tablets exist. The patterns across them are consistent enough and specific enough that they carry a weight most treatments of this material have never fully confronted. Because most treatments of this material are looking for mythology. What they find, if they read carefully enough, if they follow the pattern across enough independent sources, is something that feels different from mythology. Something that feels, in its administrative precision, in its institutional specificity, in its calm procedural record of a decision made and executed, and then renegotiated in its aftermath, something that feels like a record of a decision about us, made before we were us, by beings who designed what we are, and then, for reasons the tablets describe with uncomfortable clarity, decided that what they had designed had become too much of itself. Somewhere in southern Iraq, beneath the flat, river-threaded plains of ancient Mesopotamia, in the ruins of a temple library at a place called Nippur, a team of excavators from the University of Pennsylvania came in the last decade of the 19th century and began to pull clay from the earth. 30,000 tablets, fragments of a civilization so old that the very concept of civilization barely predates it. Records of a world that had been waiting in the ground for somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years for someone to come and read what they said. One of those tablets, designated CBS 10673 in the Penn Museum's collections, named by the 20th century scholar Thorvald Jakobsen, the Eridogenesis, is broken. A third of its surface is missing. What survives is organized into 6 columns of cuneiform script, so small you need magnification to read it. It dates in its physical form to approximately 1600 BC, but records traditions reaching back more than 5,000 years. What it contains, in the sections that survive, is a specific claim about the nature of the world we live in. The world we live in is not the first world. The humanity we are is not the first humanity. Something existed before us, something different, something that the beings who made it eventually found intolerable, something that was erased gradually, then catastrophically, then completely, by a process that the tablet describes in the same flat administrative register that the scribes of Nippur used for grain inventories and legal contracts. And then the world was rebuilt, and we were installed in it. And the tablet was copied, faithfully, for 1,000 years after the flood, it describes. Copied by scribes who understood that their role was preservation, not interpretation, not embellishment, not the making of meaning, but the keeping alive of something received, something that had almost not made it through. They kept it alive for us, 5,000 years, waiting in the clay. And tonight you are going to hear it. Find a position that is comfortable. Let the room settle into whatever darkness it holds. Because what follows is not a theory, and it is not a legend, and it is not the kind of story that asks you to believe anything before the evidence has been laid before you. It is a survey of what the oldest human records actually say, about what we were before we were this, about who decided to change it, about why, and about what it cost. You have felt it before. Most people have, though few have a precise name for it. It comes in specific places. The remains of something old, a foundation stone in a field where no building stands anymore, a stretch of road whose original makers are centuries gone, a shoreline where the tide uncovers things that were buried before your grandparents were born. You are standing in a place where something significant happened. You were not there for it. There is no one left who was. And yet the place holds a quality, a specific texture in the air, or the light, or the silence, that carries the shape of what occurred, even though the occurrence itself is entirely gone. This is not mysticism. It is the ordinary human experience of standing at the edge of an erasure. Historians and archaeologists describe versions of this feeling with technical language: the palimpsest, the stratigraphy, the record of successive occupation visible in the layers of a site. But the feeling itself precedes the language. It is the sensation of a gap in the record that is nevertheless somehow present as a gap, a silence that has the shape of the sound that preceded it. The scholars who first worked seriously on the Sumerian creation and flood texts describe something like this sensation in their accounts of the material. Not universally, not explicitly, but in the margins of their professional observations, a quality of the texts that was difficult to account for within the ordinary frameworks of ancient Near Eastern religious literature. Thorvald Jakobsen, whose 1981 translation and analysis of the Eridu-Genesis remains one of the foundational texts in the field, noted in his treatment of the tablet's opening sections a phrase that he rendered as describing humanity in a state of having been forgotten. This was his translation of a specific Sumerian construction in the surviving text, a phrase that describes the condition of humanity before the goddess Nintur's intervention, before the cities were built, before the kings were appointed. Forgotten, not punished, not judged, not destroyed or cast out or condemned. Forgotten. Sit with that word for a moment, because it is doing something that the other options are not doing. Punishment implies a relationship that has been violated, an authority that still acknowledges the existence of the one being punished. Judgment implies engagement, a case being heard, a verdict being rendered. Even destruction implies a specific act directed at a specific object by a specific agent. Forgetting is different. Forgetting is what happens when something that was once within attention falls outside of it. When a relationship that once carried intention, design, purpose, oversight, simply lapses. When the thing that was made is no longer being considered by the ones who made it. For the humanity described in the opening sections of the Eridu-Genesis, the condition before restoration was not oppression. It was absence of attention. They wandered, the text suggests, on their trails, without cities, without agriculture, without kings. Not because these things had been withheld as punishment, but because the beings who were responsible for providing them had, for whatever reason, turned their attention elsewhere. What had happened in the gap? What had created the condition of forgetting? The tablet, broken as it is, does not tell us directly. The missing third of CBS 10673 may contain something relevant. It may not. What we have is the moment of restoration, the goddess turning back, remembering, resolving to rebuild, the moment before the return of attention. But the word forgotten implies that there was a before, a time when humanity was not forgotten, a time when attention was present, when design was active, when the beings responsible for human civilization were engaged with the project of human civilization in a way that they subsequently, for reasons the surviving text does not preserve, ceased to be. The Eridu-Genesis is the restoration story. What it does not fully tell is the story of what was lost before the restoration began. That story is scattered across the other tablets. The Atrahasis epic, the Sumerian king list, the Enki and Ninmah myth, the concept of the me, the instructions of Shurupak. Assembled carefully, read with the attention the scribes who preserved them believed they deserved. These texts begin to form the outline of what was in the room before the restoration. What existed in the period the Eridu-Genesis refers to as the time of forgetting, and the texts around it describe with a specificity that is unusual for mythological literature. The outline of the first version and the shape of what erased it. The tablet designated CBS 10673 in the collections of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia is made of baked clay. It is broken. A significant portion of its original surface, perhaps a third, perhaps slightly more, is missing, lost to the earth or to the centuries, and has not been recovered. What remains is organized into 6 columns of cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing system of ancient Mesopotamia, pressed into the clay with a cut reed while the material was still wet. The individual signs are small enough that modern scholars require magnification to read them clearly. The tablet was excavated at the site of ancient Nippur in what is now southern Iraq during the University of Pennsylvania's Babylonian expedition, which operated in the region between 1888 and 1900. The field team, led at various points by John Peters and John Henry Haynes, recovered the tablet from the remains of what scholars identify as a temple library, a repository of clay documents maintained by the professional scribes attached to the temple complex. The tablets in this library had been buried for somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years before the excavators reached them. CBS 10,673 dates in its surviving physical form to approximately 1600 BC. This is the date of the clay itself, when the tablet in your mind's eye was made, when the scribe sat down with wet clay and a cut reed and pressed these specific signs into this specific surface. But the text the scribe was copying is considerably older. The literary tradition recorded on CBS 10673 reaches back, through a chain of earlier copies and oral antecedents, into the 3rd millennium BC and possibly beyond, into a period more than 5,000 years ago when the tradition it records was already ancient. The name given to this tablet, not by the Sumerians who created the tradition it preserves, but by the 20th century scholar Thorvald Jakobson, is the Eridu Genesis. Eridu, because the text places the origins of civilization at the city of Eridu, the Sumerian first city, the seat of the god Enki. Genesis, because what the text contains, in the sections that survive, is an account of the origins of human civilization, the establishment of cities, the institution of kingship, the relationship between humanity and the divine administration, and the flood that ended the world that preceded the world the Sumerians knew. What CBS 10673 contains, past the mythology, past the theological framing, past the flood narrative that dominates its surviving columns, is a specific claim about the nature of humanity's origins. The claim is not that humanity was created once and left to flourish. The claim, read carefully against the other tablets that the Penn Museum's excavations and subsequent Mesopotamian archaeology have recovered, is that humanity was created, found wanting in a specific administrative sense, and restored in a modified form. The tablet is in Philadelphia. It has not moved significantly since the excavators lifted it from the earth. It has been examined, photographed, transliterated, translated, joined to additional fragments as they were identified, and incorporated into the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature maintained by the University of Oxford. The Penn Museum continues to hold it in the care of a custodial institution that has, in its way, continued the work the Nippur temple scribes began, preserving accurately, without embellishment, what the clay contains. But the clay is incomplete. The missing third is still missing. What those fragments said, whether they contained information about the period before the restoration, the nature of the first version, the specific circumstances of the forgetting, remains in the ground somewhere in southern Iraq, if it survives at all. What we have is the part that made it through, and the part that made it through is enough to begin, This is not a rhetorical point. It is a calibration of scale that matters for everything that follows. The Sumerian civilization that produced the Eridu Genesis was not a culture that left behind a handful of damaged texts from which scholars have painfully reconstructed fragments of a lost mythology. It was a civilization that recorded everything on a medium so durable that 5,000 years in the earth barely damaged it, in quantities large enough that the majority of surviving tablets have not yet been fully translated or published. The total number of known cuneiform tablets across all world collections runs to somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million individual items. The Penn Museum's excavations at Nippur alone recovered approximately 30,000 tablets and fragments. The British Museum holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform objects in its collections. The Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the Louvre in Paris, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Ashmolean in Oxford, these institutions collectively hold a body of written material from ancient Mesopotamia, so large that teams of scholars working across the 20th and 21st centuries have only penetrated its surface. The scribes who produced this archive were professionals of a specific and demanding kind. They trained in institutions the Sumerians called the Aduba, the tablet house, where students spent years learning to copy texts exactly, sign by sign, with a precision that was treated not merely as an intellectual standard, but as a form of religious practice. The Aduba school texts from Nippur, preserved in the Penn Museum's collections, tell us explicitly that the scribal student's purpose was to copy what existed, not to invent what was new. Errors in reproduction were understood not as mistakes, but as defilements, a failure of fidelity to the original that had a moral as well as intellectual dimension. The texts these scribes copied were frequently much older than the copies they were making. A scribe in Nippur in 1800 BC might be copying a text whose original composition predated him by 1,000 years, and the text he produced might itself be copied by a scribe 1,000 years after his own death, who would reproduce it with the same fidelity, the same sign-by-sign precision, the same understanding that his role was preservation rather than composition. The instructions of Shurupak provide the clearest illustration of this process. This text, one of the oldest surviving works of wisdom literature in the world, attributed within the Sumerian literary tradition to a pre-flood figure whose name is the same as the last antediluvian city on the Sumerian king list, was copied and recopied across a span of more than 1,000 years. Bent Alster, whose 1974 critical edition of the instructions remains the scholarly standard, demonstrated that the text remained remarkably stable across this entire span of reproduction. The content did not change substantially across 10 centuries of copying in multiple cities by multiple scribal traditions. A text that is reproduced faithfully across 1,000 years without substantial alteration is not simply a popular story. It is something that the people doing the copying understood could not be changed, not because they lacked the ability to change it. Scribes were educated, sophisticated people entirely capable of literary composition, but because they understood themselves as custodians of something received rather than authors of something composed. The text belonged to a tradition that preceded them. Their role was to carry it forward intact, not to improve it, not to update it, not to make it more accessible or more relevant to their contemporary audience. This is the archive within which the Sumerian creation and flood texts exist. Not popular mythology composed for entertainment, not theological poetry composed for worship, though they served both purposes. Curated records maintained by a professional class whose identity was bound up with accuracy, whose understanding of their own role was fundamentally custodial. When the Nippur scribes copied the account of the Anunnaki's decision to erase the first version of humanity, they were not composing a dramatic narrative. They were preserving something they had received, in the form in which they had received it, because they understood that their job was to keep it alive until the next generation of custodians could take it from their hands. The question is, what they believed they were keeping alive. And the answer, embedded in the very structure of the texts they preserved, is more specific and more unsettling than most treatments of this material have fully acknowledged. No single Sumerian tablet says, there was a first version of humanity and the Anunnaki erased it. This is important to establish clearly. The tablets do not state the argument of this script in plain language. They were not written as an argument. They were written as records, administrative documents, religious texts, mythological narratives, wisdom literature, each serving its own purpose within the civilization that produced it. But across these texts, read together, a pattern assembles itself. A pattern consistent enough, specific enough, and, crucially, independent enough across multiple sources from multiple sites from multiple time periods that it carries a weight the individual texts alone do not. The Eridu Genesis describes humanity as forgotten in a pre-civilizational state, then restored, not created for the first time, but brought back to a condition of organized existence that the text implies once existed before. The word restoration, rather than creation, is doing significant work in this text. You do not restore something that never existed. You restore something that existed, was lost, and is now being returned to its previous condition. The Atrahasis epic describes humanity as designed for a specific purpose, then proliferating beyond that purpose's intended parameters, then subjected to 3 rounds of graduated population reduction, then reduced catastrophically through a flood, then redesigned with new parameters built into the replacement version. This is not a creation story in any simple sense. It is a story about a design that went wrong, a series of attempts to correct it, and a final reset that produced a modified replacement. The Sumerian king list records a world before the flood of extraordinary stability and duration. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years, followed by 7 words, and then a completely different world after. The same administrative document, the same format, a genuine discontinuity in the nature of what it was recording, marked by a phrase whose brevity is completely disproportionate to the scale of what it describes. The Enki and Ninmah myth describes the creation of humanity as an iterative process, multiple forms attempted, evaluated, placed within the social structure, if functional, left without a place, if not. The version that became the first humanity was not the first thing that emerged from the design process. It was the result of experimentation. There were earlier forms. There were parallel attempts. The dominant pre-flood human was a selected outcome, not an original conception. The concept of the me, the divine ordinances governing every aspect of civilized existence, suggests that the knowledge and organizational structures of civilization were not developed by human beings over time, but delivered to humanity as a pre-existing package. Civilization, in the Sumerian framework, was not invented. It was installed. The scribal arts, listed among the me, were divine ordinances rather than human achievements. The institution of kingship descended from heaven rather than emerging from human political development. Taken individually, Each of these texts supports the mainstream scholarly interpretation of sophisticated ancient Mesopotamian religious thought, a theological framework in which divine authority governs every aspect of human existence. Creation is an act of deliberate divine will, and the conditions of human life reflect divine decisions, rather than natural processes. Taken together, they form something more specific. They form the outline of a version of humanity that preceded the Sumerian civilization and was structurally different from it. A version that existed for an incomprehensible duration in a condition of near-perfect administrative stability. A version that was created for a specific purpose and gradually exceeded the parameters of that purpose. A version that was subjected to deliberate demographic management by the administration that created it and ultimately erased by a catastrophic event that the same administration engineered, debated, executed, and then partially regretted. And a version that was replaced, deliberately, specifically, with modifications, by the version that inherited the Sumerian civilization, copied its records, maintained its temples, and eventually buried the evidence in the earth at Nippur, where it waited for someone to find it. We are that version. And to understand why the first version was erased, we first have to understand the beings who erased it, the Anunnaki, not as the popular imagination has rendered them, as the tablets describe them, a bureaucracy, a divine administration with competing factions, internal politics, a decision-making structure that required collective oaths, and a chief executive who found the noise of his own creation intolerable. That is where we go next. You have heard the word Anunnaki before. If you encountered it through popular culture, through documentary films with dramatic narration and dramatic music, through internet forums where ancient civilizations become evidence for whatever the author already believed, through the particular genre of speculative history that treats every ancient text as a coded message waiting for a modern interpreter to unlock, then what you heard was probably one of two things. Either beings from another planet who arrived on Earth in the distant past and engineered humanity as a slave race, or symbols, metaphors, the projected divine imaginings of a pre-scientific people trying to explain a world they did not yet have the tools to understand. Both of these framings share a flaw. They tell you what the Anunnaki mean to us. Neither of them tells you what the Anunnaki were to the people who wrote about them. So, set aside what you have heard. Set aside the frameworks that were built around these texts long after the texts themselves were written, and return to the clay. What do the tablets actually say about the Anunnaki? The word itself is Sumerian. The most widely accepted scholarly reconstruction of its components parses as follows. An, the sky, heaven, the highest divine realm. Unna, princely, of noble descent, carrying authority. Ki, the earth. The Anunnaki are, in the most literal rendering the language supports, the princely ones of heaven and earth. The great gods, distinguished in the cuneiform record from a second class of divine beings, the Igigi, who occupy a lower position in the divine hierarchy, and whose labor and subsequent revolt are, as we will examine in detail, the proximate cause of humanity's creation. But the word itself is less important than what the tablets describe when they use it. The Anunnaki in the Sumerian and Akkadian record are not a pantheon in the way the Greek gods constitute a pantheon. A collection of individual divine personalities with distinct domains and dramatic personal histories, worshipped by a culture that understood their stories as illuminating the human condition through divine analogy. The Anunnaki are an administration, a governing structure with specific roles, specific jurisdictions, specific decision-making procedures, and, crucially, specific mechanisms for managing internal disagreement. The divine assembly, called the Ubshukina in Sumerian, the place of assembly in the great courtyard, was not a metaphor for deliberation. It was, within the world of the E-Hall tablets, an actual institutional structure. The great gods gathered, they debated, they reached decisions. Those decisions were binding on all parties present, and when the decision being made was sufficiently consequential, the kind of decision that individual gods with competing interests might be tempted to undermine, the assembly required an oath, a collective binding commitment that removed from each individual god the option of acting on their private disagreement. The fact that oaths were required is itself evidence of something important. You do not require an oath from beings who have no inclination to defect. The divine assembly's use of collective oath-taking as a mechanism for binding consequential decisions tells us that the Anunnaki, as the tablets describe them, were capable of and inclined toward exactly the kind of individual dissent that made collective commitment mechanisms necessary. Enki dissented, repeatedly, consequentially. The oath before the flood was designed specifically to prevent him from doing what he had done 3 times before, finding a way to protect humanity from Enlil's population reduction programs. The oath was an institutional response to a specific pattern of individual defection. It was the kind of procedural constraint that governing bodies develop when they have learned, through experience, that certain members cannot be trusted to comply with majority decisions voluntarily. This is not the behavior of a mythological pantheon. It is the behavior of a governing council. The Anunnaki were an administration, and the decision to erase the first version of humanity was an administrative decision, proposed, debated, adopted through institutional process, executed through collective action, and then renegotiated in its aftermath when it became clear that the execution had been incomplete. Understanding this changes how you hear everything that follows. The erasure of the first version of humanity was not an act of divine wrath. It was not the thunderous fury of an offended deity. It was a policy decision, reached through institutional channels, by a governing body with competing factions, in response to a management problem that 3 previous policy interventions had failed to solve. The beings who made it were not inscrutable cosmic forces. They were administrators with agendas, histories, relationships, and the specific institutional behaviors of people who have been in positions of power long enough to develop habits, preferences, and the capacity for genuine regret. We need to meet them individually, because the erasure was not the act of a unified will. It was the resolution of a conflict between specific beings with specific stakes in the outcome. And that conflict, between Enlil, who wanted the noise to stop, and Enki, who refused to let what he built be destroyed, is the drama within which the first version of humanity lived and died and left the faintest outline of itself in the clay. Of all the figures in the Sumerian divine administration, Enlil is the one most difficult for a modern reader to hold clearly. He is not evil. The tablets do not present him as evil. He does not take pleasure in human suffering. He is not a tyrant in the theatrical sense, a being who destroys because destruction satisfies something in him. He is something harder to process than a villain, and in some ways more disturbing. He is an administrator who cannot tolerate dysfunction. Enlil's domain, as the Sumerian and Akkadian texts consistently describe it, is the surface of the earth, the space between heaven and the deep waters below. wind, storm, the breath of life, the boundary conditions within which earthly existence occurs. He is the chief executive authority over the inhabited world. His city was Nippur, the very city whose temple library preserved most of what we know about him. The scribes who recorded his decision to flood the earth worked in his house. They maintained his records, copied his hymns, preserved his administrative history with the same faithful precision they brought to every other text in the library. The Nippur scribal tradition was Enlil's tradition. The record of his worst decision was preserved in his own archive. There is something in this that the Sumerians understood, and that we should too. The faithful preservation of an uncomfortable truth is itself a form of integrity. The scribes did not soften Enlil's role in the flood. They recorded it plainly in the same administrative register they used for grain inventories. Enlil's character, assembled from across the Nippur texts, is consistent. He is the god of order, not order in the abstract philosophical sense, order as an operational requirement. The world functions within specific parameters. Those parameters are maintained by specific mechanisms. When the parameters are exceeded, when the system runs beyond its design tolerances, the administrator, responsible for maintaining it, takes corrective action. This is Enlil's relationship to humanity throughout the Atrahasis epic. He does not hate the humans. The text does not record hatred. What it records is something more recognizable and in some ways more chilling: professional dissatisfaction. The humans have exceeded their design parameters. They have grown too numerous. Their collective noise, the Akkadian rigmu, the clamor of a large population living its life, has risen to a level that interferes with Enlil's ability to function. He cannot sleep. This detail, preserved in the Atrahasis epic with the same plainness that characterizes all of its administrative passages, is worth dwelling on. The chief executive authority over the surface of the earth cannot sleep because of the noise of the beings installed on that surface. This is not the complaint of a god whose divine dignity has been offended. It is the complaint of someone whose operational environment has become untenable. The system he oversees is producing interference that affects his capacity to do his job. His response is proportionate to his character. He does not strike out in rage. He convenes a process. He identifies the problem: excessive human population. He identifies a solution: population reduction. He selects an instrument: the plague deity Namtara. He initiates the program. When the program is circumvented by Enki, Enlil does not immediately escalate to catastrophic measures. He tries again with different instruments: drought, famine, a combined suppression of natural abundance designed to bring human numbers down to a manageable level. Each attempt is graduated. Each is targeted. Each is calibrated to reduce without eliminating, because Enlil, for all his administrative coldness, is not trying to commit genocide. He is trying to restore the system to its designed operating parameters. The lament for the destruction of Ur, a Sumerian text preserved on tablets from multiple sites including Nippur and Ur, offers a different angle on Enlil's administrative character. In this text, Enlil decrees the destruction of the city of Ur, not in fury, not in response to moral transgression, but as an administrative decision about which cities would flourish and which would fall in a given period. The lament's narrator mourns the destruction. Enlil issued the decree. The decree was executed. The city fell, and the text records Enlil's decree in the same flat procedural language that characterizes all his actions in the Sumerian record. This is a being for whom the destruction of a city is an item on an administrative agenda. The flood is the same thing, scaled up, an operational decision, a final solution to a management problem that 3 previous solutions had failed to address. Enlil's fury when he discovers that Atrahasis has survived is not the fury of a being whose cruelty has been thwarted. It is the frustration of an administrator whose policy was implemented imperfectly. The outcome he required was not achieved. The noise problem has not been solved. Humanity exists again on the surface of the earth that he is responsible for managing. His response to this frustration, his acceptance of Enki's post-flood redesign proposal, tells us something final and important about Enlil's character. He is not irrational. When Enki offers him a structural solution to the noise problem, built-in demographic controls that will prevent the pre-flood population levels from being reached again, Enlil accepts it, not because he has had a change of heart, because the solution addresses his operational requirement. The first version of humanity was erased because the being responsible for maintaining the Earth's surface found it operationally intolerable. Not because it had sinned, not because it had transgressed divine law, because it had grown too numerous and too loud for the administrator who oversaw it to function effectively. If you are looking for a villain in this story, Enlil will disappoint you. He is not a villain. He is something the modern world knows well and finds much harder to reckon with than villainy. He is a manager who solved a problem. If Enlil is the Anunnaki who makes the erasure comprehensible, Enki is the one who makes it bearable. He is the most human figure in the divine administration, not because he is weak or sentimental, but because his intelligence runs sideways. He finds angles, he identifies loopholes, he works within systems while quietly subverting their most intolerable requirements. He is the kind of being who can sit in a room where a terrible decision is being made, formally assent to it, and then find a way to technically comply with every letter of his commitment while defeating its entire purpose. He is, in the most recognizable human sense, a dissenter who has learned to work within institutions. Enki's domain is the Abzu, the freshwater deep beneath the earth, the subterranean reservoir from which rivers rise and springs emerge. He is the Lord of wisdom, of craft, of magic, of the lateral intelligence that finds solutions where direct approaches fail. His city is Eridu, the first city, the oldest sacred site in the Sumerian world, the place where civilization, in the Sumerian account, first descended from heaven. His role in humanity's creation is foundational in the most literal sense. When the Igigi revolted and the great gods needed a solution to the labor crisis, it was Enki who proposed the creation of the Lulu. It was Enki who oversaw the design. It was the intelligence of the slain god mixed into the clay at Enki's direction. The divine understanding, the Temu, that gave the first humans their cognitive capacity. He built humanity. With his knowledge, with his oversight, with his specific decision to include divine intelligence in the mixture that produced the first version. And then he spent the entire pre-flood period protecting what he had built from the administrative machinery of the being who found it excessive. His 3 pre-flood interventions, advising Atrahasis to direct worship specifically to the plague deity during the first reduction program, finding workarounds during the drought and famine phases, are not acts of open defiance. Enki does not stand before the divine assembly and refuse Enlil's decrees. He does not mount a theological argument for humanity's right to exist in whatever numbers it chooses. He operates in the margins. He finds the mechanism that Enlil's program did not account for and exploits it quietly, from the side, while maintaining formal compliance with the administrative framework. This is important. Enki is not a rebel. He is a bureaucrat who disagrees with a policy and routes around it through legal and technical means. He does not challenge Enlil's authority. He challenges Enlil's specific applications of that authority by finding the exceptions, the loopholes, the overlooked mechanisms that Enlil's programs failed to foreclose. The reed wall is the distilled expression of Enki's character and the most remarkable moment in the entire Sumerian flood narrative. Bound by the oath of the divine assembly, the collective commitment not to warn humanity, Enki cannot speak directly to Atrahasis. The oath forecloses direct communication, so Enki goes to the house of Atrahasis and speaks his warning to the wall, to the reed fence, not to the man. Wall, hear me. Reed fence, pay attention. Man of Shurupak, son of Ubaratutu, tear down your house, build a boat. The words are not addressed to Atrahasis. They are addressed to an architectural feature of his dwelling. Atrahasis is present. He hears. The warning is received. The oath is technically honored. Its purpose is entirely defeated. Scholars have analyzed this passage from multiple angles, as a literary device, as a theological statement about divine omniscience and the limits of divine commitments, as a narrative mechanism for explaining how the flood hero received his warning despite the divine oath. All of these analyses are valid. What they sometimes underemphasize is the sheer recognizability of what Enki is doing. This is what someone does when they are bound by a rule they find unjust, but cannot openly violate without consequences they are not prepared to accept. They comply with the letter. They defeat the spirit. They find the construction that satisfies the formal requirement while achieving the outcome they actually want. Enki wanted Atrahasis to survive. The oath prevented him from warning Atrahasis. The reed wall was the solution, a piece of creative compliance that honored the form of the commitment while rendering it operationally void. We are here, in part, because of this moment. The second version of humanity, the one the Sumerians knew, the one we are descended from in the continuity of human existence on this planet, exists because one member of the divine administration found a loophole and used it at the last possible moment before the flood destroyed everything. But Enki's role does not end with the warning. The post-flood negotiation is also his work. When Enlil discovers that humanity has survived and erupts in administrative fury, it is Enki who manages the aftermath. He argues. He negotiates. He offers the structural redesign of the replacement version as a solution to the noise problem. Built-in demographic controls that will prevent the pre-flood situation from recurring. He trades Enlil the satisfaction of a permanently managed human population for the continued existence of humanity in any form. Enki saves humanity twice, first through the reed wall, then through the negotiating table, and what he saves is not the first version. The first version is gone. What he saves is the possibility of a second version, a modified, redesigned, demographically constrained replacement that carries forward the essential continuity of the human project while incorporating the limits that Enlil required. We are Enki's compromise, the version of humanity that exists because the being who built the original refused to let it be entirely erased and was willing to accept significant modifications to prevent that outcome. There is something in Enki's character that the tablets preserve across hundreds of texts and thousands of years of reproduction that feels, in the end, less like a god and more like a particular kind of person. The kind who builds things because they care about what gets built, who fights for what they made not through confrontation, but through persistence, creativity, and the patient exploitation of every available mechanism that the systems constraining them fail to foreclose. The first version of humanity had Enki as its advocate. The second version exists because his advocacy, even in defeat, found a way to leave something behind. Before there was a first version of humanity, there was a problem that made its creation necessary. And before there was a problem, there was labor. The Atrahasis epic does not begin with the earth or the sea or a god alone in darkness. It begins with work. Specifically, it begins with divine work, the labor of the Igigi, the lesser gods, tasked with maintaining the physical infrastructure of the Mesopotamian world, digging the rivers, carving the canals, building and sustaining the irrigation networks that made the flat, river-threaded plain of southern Mesopotamia into productive agricultural land. This labor, the text tells us, lasted for 3,600 years. 1 sar, the base unit of Sumerian numerical reckoning, the number from which the extraordinary reign lengths of the antediluvian kings are composed. The Igigi worked for 1 sar, and then they stopped. They burned their digging tools in the night. They surrounded the house of Enlil. They refused to continue. The divine assembly convened in emergency session. Enlil was disturbed. The text records his distress with characteristic plainness. The lesser gods, the workforce he had relied on for 3.5 millennia, were in revolt. The infrastructure of the world required labor to maintain. Without labor, the canals would silt up. The irrigation networks would fail. The agricultural system that sustained the divine household would collapse. Enki proposed a solution: create a substitute workforce, a being designed specifically to take over the labor the Igigi were refusing. Built from the earth, from clay, but incorporating enough divine substance to give it the intelligence required to understand and execute the work. The Lulu, the primitive worker. The Igigi's revolt is the origin story of humanity. Without it, without 3.5 millennia of divine labor followed by collective refusal, there is no reason for the Anunnaki to create human beings at all. We exist within the framework the Atrahasis epic establishes because the first workforce went on strike. This context matters for understanding the first version of humanity's eventual fate. The Igigi revolted because their labor exceeded what they were willing to endure. The first version of humanity, created to replace the Igigi, eventually produced a different kind of excess, not refusal, but proliferation. The beings created to solve the labor problem became, in Enlil's assessment, a problem of their own. The solution had generated a new version of the original difficulty. There is a circularity here that the Sumerian scribes may have intended. The world required labor. The beings tasked with providing it eventually exceeded their assigned role. The solution to their excess became, in time, the next thing requiring management. As if the act of creation itself, the installation of any being capable of intelligence and accumulation, inevitably produces the same outcome: excess, proliferation, noise. But it is Ninhursag, also called Ninma, Nintu, Ma, the mother goddess of multiple names and one essential function, who brings us closest to the actual process by which the first version was made. The Atrahasis epic names her as the one who will form the new being, her hands, her biological craft. the clay mixed with divine substance, the flesh and blood of the slain god Wei-Ilu, whose understanding, whose temu, would pass into the mixture and give the first humans their cognitive capacity. Ninhursag worked the clay. Ninhursag shaped the first 14 humans, 7 male, 7 female, and placed them before the divine assembly. The Enki and Ninmah myth preserves a supplementary account of her creative process that reveals its experimental character more fully. In this myth, Set after humanity has already been created to relieve the Igigi's labor burden, Ninhursag, here called Ninmah, issues a challenge to Enki during a divine celebration. She claims that the nature of a human being, its condition whether good or ill, rests in her hands. She can shape the form, and Enki will have to find a place for whatever she produces. What she produces, in the sequence that follows, is a series of beings created from clay, 7 of them by most scholarly reconstructions of the fragmentary text, each one impaired in a specific way. One cannot move its hands, one cannot see, one cannot control its bodily functions, one is paralyzed, one cannot bear children. The 6th and 7th are described in terms that the fragmentary state of the surviving tablets makes difficult to render precisely, but which appear to involve impairments to mobility and cognition. For each one that Ninmah produces, Enki finds a role. The one who cannot move its hands is given a position where manual labor is not required. The blind one is given the art of music, which the sightless can practice and master. Each impaired being is placed within the social structure of civilization, assigned a function that matches its specific capacity. The mainstream scholarly reading of this passage treats it as a Sumerian theological framework for understanding physical impairment, a mythological explanation for why some human beings are born with limited capacities, and an argument for their integration into the social order rather than their exclusion. This reading is well supported and genuinely important, but the experimental character of the sequence also reveals something about Ninhursag as a creator. She is not working from a fixed blueprint that produces perfect results. She is working with clay and divine substance and the creative capacity of her craft, and what emerges is not always what was intended or what is most functional. Some of what she makes works well within the social structure. Some of it works partially, some of it barely works at all. Creation, for Ninhursag, is an iterative process. She has made beings before. She will make beings again. The first version of humanity that became the dominant pre-flood population was not the first thing that emerged from her workshop. It was the version that worked well enough to deploy at scale. When the flood came, Ninhursag wept. The Atrahasis epic records her grief with a directness that stands in sharp contrast to Enlil's administrative composure. She had spoken evil in the divine assembly, she says. She had agreed to something that she now, watching its execution, found unbearable. The beings she had made with her hands, the clay she had worked, the substance she had shaped, were being returned to the water and the earth. Ninhursag's grief in the flood narrative is the emotional center of the Anunnaki's relationship to the first version of humanity. Enlil found them excessive and managed them toward erasure. Enki found a loophole and preserved one. Ninhursag, who had made them, simply wept. These 3 responses, the administrator's management, the engineer's defiance, the maker's grief, are the emotional architecture of the erasure. And they map, with uncomfortable precision, onto the range of responses that any institution produces when it does something terrible in the name of operational necessity. There was a night when the decision became final. We cannot date it. The tablets do not record it as a historical event with a specific time and place in the ordinary sense. But the Atrahasis epic describes its structure. The gathering, the proposal, the mechanism that was required to make the decision binding, with enough precision that we can reconstruct its shape, if not its exact circumstances. The divine assembly convened. The Ubshukina, the chamber of fates, the great courtyard of the divine complex where the Anunnaki gathered to make the decisions that govern the world. The great gods present. The issue on the table, 3 rounds of graduated population reduction, had failed to solve the noise problem. The lesser plague, the drought, the combined suppression of natural abundance, each one had been circumvented by Enki's counter-interventions. Each one had seen the human population recover and continue to grow. Enlil's proposal was the flood, total, complete, water from above in the form of storm, water from below, the Abzu itself, Enki's own domain, opened against the surface of the earth. 7 days and 7 nights of simultaneous deluge designed to leave nothing on the surface of the inhabited world alive. The previous 3 interventions had failed because Enki had advised Atrahasis to neutralize them through targeted worship of the specific divine instruments being deployed. The flood's design foreclosed this option. There was no plague deity to propitiate. There was no specific instrument to neutralize through prayer. The flood was total, not a targeted instrument, but a systemic reset of the entire surface of the earth. But Enlil understood, based on 3 previous rounds of circumvention, that the flood alone was not sufficient. Enki needed to be bound, not simply outvoted, bound, committed through a mechanism that removed from him the option of acting on his disagreement. The oath. Every god present in the divine assembly would swear not to warn humanity, not to advise, not to communicate by any means the coming of the flood. The warning that Enki had given 3 times through indirect channels would be foreclosed by a collective commitment that each god took upon themselves in the presence of all the others. Think carefully about what this required. Ninhursag, who had made humanity with her hands, was in that room. She swore. The text records her subsequent grief during the flood. She had spoken evil in the divine assembly, which tells us that the oath was not taken with enthusiasm. It was taken, but not without cost. Enki, who had built humanity's cognitive capacity and protected it through 3 rounds of reduction, was in that room. He swore. He took the oath that bound him to silence. He committed, in the presence of the full divine assembly, to not warning the humans he had spent the entire pre-flood period protecting. And then he went to the house of Atrahasis. He sat beside the wall, the reed fence that formed the boundary between the interior of the house and the outside world, and he spoke his warning to the reeds. Wall, hear me. Reed fence, pay attention. Man of Shurapak, son of Ubaratutu, tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life, spurn property, save life. Load into the boat the seed of all living creatures. The boat you build, let its dimensions be measured. Let its width and length be equal. Atrahasis heard every word. He was in the room. The wall was in the room. Enki was speaking to the wall. The technical distinction between speaking to a wall and speaking to the man on the other side of that wall is the distinction between honoring an oath and violating it. It is the thinnest possible distinction. It is a distinction that exists entirely in the formal structure of the commitment, rather than in any practical or moral reality. Enki warned Atrahasis. He warned him completely, specifically, with all the information Atrahasis needed to survive the flood. He honored his oath by not technically speaking to a human being, while entirely defeating its purpose by ensuring that a human being heard everything he said. This is not a divine act in the mythological sense, the thunderous intervention of a cosmic force operating beyond human institutional logic. This is the act of a person, a specific, recognizable kind of person. The kind who has been present in every institution in human history that has ever made a terrible decision. The person who cannot stop the decision, who is formally bound to comply with it, and who finds the minimum possible violation of formal compliance that allows them to do what they believe is right. Enki had taken an oath before the full assembly of the great gods of the Sumerian world. He honored that oath by speaking to a wall. He defeated it by ensuring the man who needed to hear was present for the speaking. The first version of humanity had been sentenced to death by a governing body that found it excessive. One member of that body, bound by a commitment he had formally accepted, found a mechanism for defeating it without technically violating it. And the survivor he chose. Atrahasis, Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, the figure who carries different names in different texts but always the same essential role, began to build. The flood was coming. The divine administration had made its decision. The first version of humanity was going to end. But not entirely. Because one man had been in the room when the warning was delivered to the wall. And on that incompleteness, that single surviving thread of the first version carried forward on a boat through 7 days of water. Everything that came after would depend. There is a moment in the Atrahasis epic that most retellings pass over too quickly. It is the moment when Enki proposes the solution to the Igigi revolt, and the specific terms of that solution are laid out before the divine assembly. Not the broad strokes, not simply let us create a being to take over the labor, but the precise design parameters. What the new being would be made from, what it would be given, what it would be for. This moment deserves to be read slowly, because it is not the creation of humanity in any sense that the word creation usually implies. It is the commissioning of a product, a being designed to specification for a defined purpose, with carefully selected inputs and a clearly articulated operational requirement. The Akkadian word the text uses is Lulu Amelu. The Sumerian equivalent is Lulu. Scholars translate it variously as primitive worker, savage human, or simply human being, though the connotations of the first two translations carry more of the original's weight than the neutrality of the third. The Lulu was not a fully realized being in the philosophical sense. It was a functional category, a type of entity designed to perform specific tasks. The word itself, in its Akkadian construction, carries suggestions of mixture, of combination, a composite being assembled from distinct components rather than arising from a single source. The design procedure, as the Atrahasis epic describes it, was precise. Clay would be used as the physical substrate, the material from which the body would be formed, but not ordinary clay. The clay would be mixed with the flesh and blood of a specific god. Not any god, a god chosen from among the Igigi themselves, the very class of divine beings whose revolt had created the need for a replacement workforce. The chosen god was called Wi-Ilu in some versions of the text. He had, the text specifies, Temu, understanding, intelligence, the capacity for cognitive engagement with the world. Wi-Ilu was killed. His substance, flesh, blood, and the intelligence that animated them was mixed into the clay. Ninhursag worked the mixture with her hands, and from this combination of earth and divine substance, the first humans were formed. Read the design parameters carefully. A physical body made from earth, animated by divine intelligence taken from a being who had possessed it fully and who was killed in order to transfer it. The intelligence was not created fresh for the new being. It was extracted from an existing being and incorporated into a new form. The first version of humanity did not develop its cognitive capacity through its own evolutionary or cultural processes. It received cognitive capacity as a component of its initial design, sourced from a divine being who no longer needed it because he had been killed to provide it. What this means for the first version's nature is something the tablets gesture toward without fully stating. A being made from earth, and divine intelligence is neither entirely material nor entirely divine. It occupies a middle category, capable of understanding and planning and executing complex tasks, but grounded in a physical substrate that is fundamentally of the earth. The divine substance that animates it is inherited rather than intrinsic, carried from its original owner into a new vessel through a procedure that the text presents as deliberate and specific. The purpose clause is unambiguous. The Lulu was created to bear the yoke, to take over the labor that the Igigi had refused, to dig the canals, to maintain the irrigation networks, to sustain the agricultural infrastructure of the Mesopotamian plain that the divine household required to function. This is not theology. This is a job description. But here is what the job description requires. A being capable of understanding instructions, planning multi-stage tasks, coordinating with other workers, maintaining complex infrastructure over long periods. Canal digging in ancient Mesopotamia was not simple. It required surveying, planning, sequential excavation, ongoing maintenance, the management of water flow through increasingly complex networks. The Lulu needed to be smart enough to do this work, significantly smart enough to understand the engineering requirements of a civilization-scale irrigation system. How much intelligence is enough to maintain an irrigation network? And how much is too much? Enough to eventually produce the proliferation and the noise that Enlil could not tolerate. The design solved the immediate problem. The Igigi's labor was replaced. The infrastructure of the world was maintained. The divine household's agricultural requirements were met. The first version of humanity performed its designed function, and then it did something its designers may not have fully anticipated. It reproduced. It multiplied. It spread across the flat, river-threaded plain of southern Mesopotamia and beyond. It filled the world with the sound of its existence, the building and the planting and the ordinary daily noise of a large population living the life it had been designed to live. The Lulu was designed to be smart enough to work. It turned out to be smart enough to become something that exceeded the parameters of work, something that filled the world with its presence beyond any threshold the administrative framework had established for acceptable occupancy. The first version of humanity's only failure was that it worked too well. The design that produced an adequate replacement for the Igigi's labor also produced a being capable of proliferating beyond its intended scale. The same cognitive capacity that allowed the Lulu to maintain irrigation networks allowed its descendants, across the extraordinary durations recorded in the King List, to grow into a population so numerous that its existence became an operational problem for the being responsible for managing the surface of the earth. Enlil had commissioned a workforce. What he got eventually was a civilization. And a civilization, with all its noise and complexity and the accumulated momentum of hundreds of thousands of years of existence, was not what the Commission had specified. The gap between what was designed and what developed is where the erasure begins. Take a moment to hold the number. 241,200 years. This is the combined reign total of the 8 kings recorded in the antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list. 8 rulers, 5 cities. 241,200 years of recorded political succession before the phrase that ends it all and begins the world we recognize. The Weld-Blundell Prism, catalog number AN.1923.444, Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, is a 4-sided clay column approximately 20 centimeters tall and 9 centimeters wide, covered on all 4 faces with 2 columns each of tightly pressed cuneiform script. It was excavated at Larsa in southern Iraq in 1922 by British archaeologist Herbert Weld-Blundell, and is now one of the most studied objects in the history of ancient Mesopotamian scholarship. It is the most complete surviving version of the Sumerian king list, the document that records, in sequence, the cities that held political supremacy in Mesopotamia, the kings who ruled in each city, and the duration of each reign. The antediluvian section opens with these names. Alulim, first king of Eridu. He reigned for 28,800 years. Alalgar, second king of Eridu. He reigned for 36,000 years. Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tabira, 43,200 years, the longest single reign in the document, the duration that sits at the apex of the antediluvian record, like a marker of maximum possible stability. Enmengal-Ana of Bad Tabira, 28,800 years. Dumuzi, the shepherd of Bad Tabira, 36,000 years. The same Dumuzi who appears elsewhere in the Sumerian literary tradition as a beloved figure, a king whose story the Sumerians told and retold across centuries of mythological literature. Here he is simply a name and a number in an administrative list. Ensipad Zid Ana of Larak, 28,800 years. Enmendur Ana of Sippar, 21,000 years. Ubara Tutu of Shurupak, 18,600 years. The last antediluvian king, the father of Ziusudra, the final name before the 7 words. Then the flood swept over. Jacobson, in his 1939 critical edition of the Sumerian king list, published by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, addressed the antediluvian reign lengths with the careful scholarly caution they deserve. He noted that the numbers are not random. They are composed using the SAR as a base unit and its subdivisions, the Enir of 600 and the Sushu of 60, suggesting a deliberate numerical system rather than arbitrary invention. He proposed that the extreme antiquity expressed by these numbers was symbolic, a literary convention for marking the primordial nature of the pre-flood era, comparable to the extraordinary lifespans of the antediluvian patriarchs in the Hebrew Bible. This remains the mainstream scholarly interpretation, and it is well grounded in what we know about ancient Near Eastern literary convention. But the Sumerian king list is not a literary text in the way that the Atrahasis epic is a literary text. It is an administrative document. It is the kind of record that a Sumerian scribe produced to track political succession, to establish legitimacy, to organize historical time in a format that could be cross-referenced against other sources. The overwhelming majority of the king list, the post-flood sections, is a sober, sequential, chronological record that overlaps at many points with independently attested history. Year names, votive inscriptions, administrative records from the cities themselves. The king list's post-flood dynasties can be checked against other evidence, and when they can be checked, they tend to hold. The pre-flood section is embedded within this same document, in the same format, presented without any indication that it represents a different kind of record than the historical material that follows it. City, king, duration, city, king, duration, the same fields, the same structure, the same administrative register. Then the flood swept over. City, king, duration, city, king, duration. The document continues. The format is unchanged. Only the numbers are different, dramatically, discontinuously, structurally different. The first post-flood king, Gar of Kish, reigned for 1,200 years. His immediate successors reigned for hundreds of years each, still implausibly long by any biological standard we recognize, but dramatically shorter than the tens of thousands of years that characterize their antediluvian predecessors. Within a few generations, the reign lengths have dropped to decades. Within the historically attested period, they are measured in years and months. The compression is not gradual, it is structural. The world that appears after the phrase, "then the flood swept over," is not a continuation of the world before it, with the numbers adjusted for accuracy. It is a different world, a world where the conditions of existence, including the duration available to the beings who inhabit it, operate according to fundamentally different parameters. The king list is recording a discontinuity, not a mythological transition from a golden age to a fallen age in the theological sense, a structural discontinuity in the actual conditions of existence, expressed in the only terms the document's format allows. Numbers. Before the flood, the numbers were vast. After the flood, they were not. Whatever the antediluvian reign lengths represent, literal lifespans of a biologically different kind of being, symbolic expressions of an era whose duration exceeds human reckoning, astronomical cycles encoded in administrative format, or some combination of all three. They are recording a claim about the pre-flood world that the king list's compiler understood as true. True enough to include in the same document as historically verifiable succession records. True enough to preserve with the same administrative precision applied to the dynasties that archaeology can confirm. The compiler of the Sumerian king list believed, or recorded the belief, that the world before the flood was different from the world after it in ways that could be measured, specifically in the duration available to the beings who existed within it, 241,200 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, then one phrase, then the world we recognize. The gap between those two worlds, between the extraordinary duration of the antediluvian era and the compressed, contested, multiply-centered post-flood civilization that the Sumerians inhabited, is the gap within which the first version of humanity lived its entire existence. We know the borders of that gap. We do not fully know what was inside it. But the king list tells us one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever was inside it was stable, extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly stable. 8 leadership transitions across 241,000 years means an average reign of over 30,000 years per king. This is not a world of political competition, succession crises, competing dynasties, or the churning instability that characterizes every post-flood entry in the same document. This was a world where the parameters were fixed, where the structure did not change, where the beings installed in it lived and governed for durations that make the entire span of recorded human history look like a brief administrative period. That world is gone. The The 7 words ended it. What remains is the outline in the numbers and the question of what filled the space between them. We cannot enter the antediluvian world. The tablets do not record it from the inside. No first-person account, no lived texture of daily existence in the 5 cities before the flood. What we have is external, administrative, the outlines of a structure without the warmth of the life that moved through it. But from the pattern of external evidence, the king list's numbers, the Atrahasis epic's design specifications, the Eridu Genesis's account of the pre-civilizational state, the concept of the me as the delivered operating parameters of existence, we can attempt a reconstruction. Careful, disciplined by what the evidence actually contains, but genuine. The first version lived in a world administered from above in a direct and ongoing way that has no equivalent in anything the post-flood record describes. The antediluvian kings were not simply political rulers in the sense that the post-flood kings were political rulers, administrators of human institutions competing with other human institutions for supremacy within a human-scale political landscape. The antediluvian kings were interfaces, points of contact between the human population and the Anunnaki administration. Their extraordinary reign lengths, if taken as representing anything real about the duration of those relationships, suggest continuity of a kind the post-flood world never achieved. The same individual maintaining the same link between the human and divine administrative layers for tens of thousands of years. The me, the divine ordinances governing every aspect of civilized existence, were not, in the antediluvian world, inherited traditions whose divine origin was a matter of theological belief rather than living experience. They were current, active. The Anunnaki who had delivered them were the same Anunnaki who were administering the world through the antediluvian kings. The rules were not old, they were immediate. Imagine a world in which the organizational structures of your civilization are not products of historical development, not institutions that evolved over centuries from earlier, simpler forms, carrying the accumulated compromises and contingencies of their own history, but delivered, current, maintained from above, by beings whose authority over them is direct and ongoing. You do not ask where the institution of kingship came from. You know where it came from. It came from the same source that is administering the world right now, through the king who has been reigning for 28,000 years in the city that was established when civilization first descended from heaven. The first version did not experience history in the way we experience history. History, as we understand it, is the record of change, the accumulation of decisions, events, contingencies that gradually transform the conditions of existence. The antediluvian world, as the King List records it, was characterized by near total stability. The same cities, the same ruling lines, the same administrative structure for an incomprehensible duration. This is not necessarily a world of happiness or suffering in any simple sense. Stability is not the same as contentment. Administration from above is not the same as care. The first version was designed for labor, canal digging, irrigation maintenance, agricultural production. Its intelligence was sufficient to perform that labor and, over time, to develop the organizational complexity that the King List's multi-city administrative structure reflects. But the fundamental relationship between the first version and the Anunnaki was not one between free beings and divine patrons. It was a management relationship. The Lulu was the workforce. The Anunnaki were the administration. The me were the operational parameters. The first version lived within a system it did not design, could not modify, and was not asked to evaluate, and it grew within that system. Generation after generation, across the extraordinary durations the king list records, the first version multiplied, the 5 cities expanded, the population filled the space available to it. The rigmu, the collective noise of hundreds of thousands or millions of beings living their designed lives, accumulated toward the threshold that Enlil could not tolerate. The first version did not know it was approaching a threshold. The tablets give no indication that the antediluvian population was aware of the administrative concern its existence was generating. Atrahasis, the exceptional individual whom Enki chose as his instrument, is described as devout and attentive, someone in close enough contact with the divine administration to receive and understand an indirect warning. But the population generally appears to have been simply living, building, planting, maintaining the infrastructure it was designed to maintain, reproducing, growing, filling the world with the accumulated sound of its existence. The first version's crime was not transgression. It was not the reaching for divine knowledge or divine power that characterizes the catastrophic mistakes of other mythological traditions. It was not moral failure in any sense the tablets identify or that Enlil articulates as a justification for reduction. The first version simply became more than it was supposed to be. It inhabited its designed existence so completely for so long that the existence overflowed its designed parameters. And the administration that had created it, that had watched it grow for 241,000 years in 5 cities under 8 kings, decided that what had overflowed needed to be contained, first gradually, then absolutely. Not everything that emerged from the divine workshop became the first version. The Enki and Ninmah myth, catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as ETCSL 1.1.2, preserved on Nippur tablets in the Penn Museum's CBS collection, is not primarily about the creation of the dominant antediluvian human form. It is about what happened in the experimental space around that creation. The beings that were produced before, alongside, or after the primary design. The forms that were functional but limited. The forms that were barely functional at all. The context is a divine celebration. The great gods are feasting. Enki and Ninmah, the engineer and the maker, are drinking together in the atmosphere of divine contentment that follows humanity's successful creation and deployment. The Igigi are no longer revolting. The infrastructure of the world is being maintained. The divine household's agricultural requirements are being met. The creation project has succeeded in its primary purpose. In this atmosphere, Ninmah issues her challenge. She claims that the nature of the human being, its condition whether good or ill, rests in her hands. She can shape the form, and Enki will have to find a place for whatever she produces. The challenge is competitive, 2 powerful creators testing each other's skills. But what the challenge produces is a window into the design process itself. Because what Ninmah makes is not a series of ideal forms that she then degrades to make Enki's task difficult. What she makes is a series of forms that her creative process actually yields. Beings that emerge from the clay with specific limitations built into their nature by the imprecision or the experimental character of the creation process itself. The one who cannot move its hands. The one who cannot see. The one who cannot control its bodily functions. The one who is paralyzed. The one who cannot bear children, the 6th, the 7th, For each one, Enki finds a role within the social structure of civilization. The one without functional hands receives a ceremonial or administrative position where manual capacity is not required. The blind one receives the gift of music, the art that the sightless can practice and master without the sense they lack. Each impaired being is placed. Each finds a function within the organized complexity of the civilized world. The mainstream scholarly reading of this passage, developed in detail by Samuel Noah Kramer and John Meyer in their 1989 work, and extended by contemporary scholars working on disability in ancient literature, treats it as a Sumerian theological framework for understanding physical impairment. A mythological explanation for why some human beings are born with limited capacities, and an argument for their integration into the social order rather than their exclusion. This reading is well supported and genuinely important, but the experimental character of the sequence also reveals something about Ninhursag as a creator. She is not working from a fixed blueprint that produces perfect results. She is working with clay and divine substance and the creative capacity of her craft, and what emerges is not always what was intended or what is most functional. Some of what she makes works well within the social structure. Some of it works partially. Some of it barely works at all. And then Enki takes his turn. What he produces from the clay is a being so comprehensively impaired, Umul in some scholarly translations, a name whose exact meaning is debated, but which carries associations with prematurity and failure, that Ninmah cannot find a role for it in any social category she can identify. This being cannot eat, cannot sit, cannot stand, cannot speak. It cannot perform any function that the organized structure of civilization provides for. Ninmah examines Umul. She addresses it. She asks it questions it cannot answer. She turns it in her hands and finds no place for it anywhere in the social order. She concedes the contest. Enki has produced something beyond placement. The mainstream reading treats Umul as a rhetorical demonstration, a being created to be unplaceable, designed by Enki specifically to win the contest by producing a result that exceeds Ninmah's capacity to accommodate. This reading is textually grounded and intellectually coherent, but sit with what the myth has shown us before Umul appears. 6 or 7 beings produced by the most skilled creator of human biological form. Beings with significant functional limitations, each one finding a marginal but real place within the social structure. The range of possible outcomes of the creation process extends from fully functional to functional, with limitations to Umul, the result that falls entirely outside any category the system provides. What happened to Umul? The text does not say he was destroyed. It does not say he was elevated. It says Ninmah could not find a place for him. He was, by implication, simply left, without placement, outside the social structure, neither integrated nor eliminated, simply beyond the reach of any category the organized world contained. The first version of humanity was not a single, uniform design. It was the selected outcome of a creative process that produced a range of results. The dominant form, the one that filled the 5 cities and generated the Rigmu, was the version that worked well enough to deploy at scale. Around it, in the margins, were the other forms. The functional but limited beings placed in roles the social structure had room for. And perhaps, in the furthest margins, the forms that found no place at all. The history of the first version that the tablets preserve is the history of its dominant form, the successful deployment that eventually exceeded its parameters. The other results of the experimental process appear only in the Enki and Ninmah myth, assigned roles or left without them, and then disappear from the record. We are descended from the version that worked. We do not know what became of the versions that didn't. The Atrahasis epic measures the pre-flood period in intervals. 1,200 years after the creation of humanity, the land had grown full. The people were numerous. Their noise was great. Enlil, convening the divine assembly, declared that the rigmu of humanity had become intolerable. He summoned Namtara, the deity of pestilence, and the first reduction program began. 1,200 years, one near, a specific, numerically precise interval between the creation of humanity and the moment its proliferation crossed Enlil's threshold of tolerance. This number, like the SAR-based reign durations of the king list, is almost certainly not a literal calendar measurement in the way we would use the term. But its specificity is meaningful. The Atrahasis epic is not describing an indefinite period of growth, followed by a vague sense of divine discomfort. It is describing a measured interval and a specific administrative response triggered at the end of it. After the first reduction program failed, after Enki's counter-intervention neutralized the plague and the human population recovered, another 1,200 years passed, and the noise rose again, and Enlil initiated the second reduction program. After the second failure, another 1,200 years, another rise of the rigmu, the third reduction program. The structure of the pre-flood period, as the Atrahasis epic records it, is a series of 1,200-year cycles: growth, noise, intervention, neutralization, recovery, growth. A rhythm that the text presents not as dramatic escalation toward an inevitable climax, but as a pattern, repeating, managed, contested between two members of the divine administration, whose disagreement about the correct response to human proliferation plays out through the bodies of the human population itself. What was the first version experiencing during these cycles? The plague that Namtara sent was not a targeted elimination of specific individuals. It fell on the population as populations experience epidemic, disease, some dying, some surviving. The community diminished but not destroyed, the society continuing to function at reduced capacity. The Atrahasis epic describes Atrahasis observing the effects of the plague, the silence of the stricken, the diminishment of the community's collective life. He understood that something was wrong. He directed the community's worship specifically to the deity responsible. The first version had enough intelligence and enough relationship with the divine administration to identify the source of the plague and respond to it through the channels of worship and propitiation that the Me had established for exactly this kind of relationship between humanity and the divine. Atrahasis's strategy, targeting worship to the specific deity being deployed against his population, is not the desperate improvisation of a frightened individual. It is the sophisticated application of a person who understands how the relationship between humanity and the Anunnaki administration works and is using that understanding to navigate a crisis. The first version, in other words, was not passive in its own reduction. It responded. It adapted. It used the tools its designed existence had given it: intelligence, worship, the channels of divine human communication established by the Me, to survive the interventions directed at it. This is perhaps the most poignant element of the pre-flood cycles. The first version was intelligent enough to survive each individual reduction program. It had been given just enough cognitive capacity to maintain the world's infrastructure, and that capacity proved sufficient, 3 times, to identify and neutralize the administrative instruments being deployed against it. The tragedy is structural. The same intelligence that made the first version a successful workforce also made it a resilient population. The same capacity for understanding and planning that kept the canals flowing also allowed Atrahasis to figure out what was killing his community and how to make it stop. The design that produced an adequate labor force also produced a population capable of surviving 3 rounds of targeted reduction. Enlil's frustration, expressed in the Atrahasis epic as a recurring complaint about the Rigmu, is the frustration of an administrator whose management tools are being defeated by the very intelligence he installed in the beings he is trying to manage. He designed them smart enough to do the work. They were smart enough not to die when he told them to. The irony is almost too clean to be accidental. But whether the Sumerian scribes who preserved this account intended the irony consciously, or whether they were simply recording what they believed to be true, the structural logic is the same. The first version survived 3 rounds of graduated reduction because it was designed to be capable of survival. And the fourth attempt, the flood, the total reset, the instrument that foreclosed, the possibility of the intelligence-based counter-strategies that had worked 3 times before, was the response to that specific capability. You could not propitiate the flood. You could not direct worship toward the water and make it stop. The flood was not a targeted instrument that could be neutralized through the channels of divine human communication the Me had established. It was a systemic reset that operated at a level above the entire structure within which the first version's intelligence was useful. Enlil found the one instrument that the first version's intelligence could not defeat, and in finding it, he finally answered his own question about how much humanity was too much. The answer was all of it, except for one man on a boat, and that one man, the last representative of the first version, the carrier of its survival into the world that would come after, is where the next act begins. Before the water, there were 3 attempts to solve the problem without water. This is the element of the Atrahasis epic that receives the least attention relative to its significance. Most treatments of the Sumerian flood narrative focus on the flood itself, the boat, the storm, the 7 days, the aftermath. The 3 pre-flood reduction programs are typically handled briefly as narrative prologue, as the literary escalation that builds dramatic tension toward the climactic deluge. But the 3 pre-flood programs are not prologue. They are the center of the story. They are the part that tells you what kind of decision the flood actually was. And they deserve to be examined with the same attention the flood itself receives. Not as mythology building toward a climax, but as a record of a specific administrative process whose structure reveals something important about the beings who designed it and the beings it was designed to manage. The first program was plague. Enlil convened the divine assembly. He articulated the problem, the Rigmu of humanity had grown intolerable, the land was too full, the noise too great. He proposed a solution. He summoned Namtara, the deity of pestilence, and directed a disease upon the human population. The plague that Namtara sent was not indiscriminate annihilation. The Atrahasis epic is specific about this. The plague reduced the human population. It killed. It diminished. It silenced sections of the community whose noise had been rising. But it did not eliminate. It was calibrated. A reduction instrument, not an extinction instrument. The goal was to bring the population back within acceptable parameters, not to end it entirely. This calibration is significant. Enlil was not, at this stage, seeking to destroy humanity. He was seeking to manage it. The plague was a management tool, the same kind of administrative instrument that an authority responsible for maintaining a system at specific operating parameters would deploy when those parameters were exceeded. Targeted, proportionate, to the defined goal, designed to produce reduction without elimination. Atrahasis observed the effects of the plague. The community around him was diminished. The silence of the stricken replaced the noise that had disturbed Enlil's rest. And Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise, the man whom Enki had already identified as his instrument, understood what was happening and knew, because Enki had found a way to communicate with him, what to do about it. He directed the community's worship specifically to Namtara, not to the gods generally, not the broad offering to the divine assembly that ordinary Sumerian religious practice prescribed. Specifically to Namtara, the deity of pestilence, the specific instrument Enlil had deployed. He concentrated the community's religious attention on the one divine being whose cooperation was required to withdraw the plague. And it worked. The plague deity, propitiated with focused and generous offerings, withdrew the plague. The population recovered. The noise began to rise again. The first program had failed. The structural reason for its failure is worth sitting with. The me, the divine ordinances governing all aspects of civilized existence, included the establishment of specific channels of divine human communication: worship, prayer, offering, propitiation. These channels were not decorative additions to the human design. They were functional components of the system, mechanisms through which the relationship between humanity and the divine administration was maintained, and through which specific divine beings could be communicated with and influenced through the correct application of the correct ritual procedures. Enlil's plague program used one of those channels as its instrument, a specific deity who operated within the same divine human communication system that the me had established. And Atrahasis, understanding the system, used that same channel to neutralize the instrument. He did not defeat the plague through cleverness or coincidence. He defeated it by correctly applying the operational logic of the me to a crisis that the me's designers had not anticipated would be used this way. Enlil had used the divine human communication system to deploy a reduction instrument. Atrahasis had used the same system to recall it. The administrator's tool had been turned against his program by the intelligence he had installed in the beings the program was targeting. The second program was drought and famine. Enlil's response to the failure of the plague was not anger in the impulsive sense. It was recalibration. The plague had failed because it operated through a channel, a specific deity, that could be neutralized through targeted propitiation. The second program would operate through a different mechanism, not a divine instrument that could be addressed through worship, but the withdrawal of natural abundance itself. The rains stopped. The crops failed. The rivers withheld their fertility. The fish and the birds, the text implies this was a divine withdrawal of their abundance, a suspension of the natural productivity that the earth normally provided, disappeared from the accessible world. The human population began to decline, not through disease but through starvation, through the slow diminishment of a community whose food sources had been systematically removed. The Atrahasis epic's account of the famine is one of the most viscerally affecting passages in the entire text. Mothers unable to feed their children, the community's social bonds straining under the accumulated weight of hunger, a world in which the earth has stopped producing and the sky has stopped delivering, and the only thing accumulating is loss. Again, Enki intervened. The precise mechanism of his second intervention is less clearly preserved in the surviving tablets than his response to the first plague. The relevant sections are damaged, but the structural outcome is clear. The human population was protected from elimination. The famine was not permitted to run its full course. Enki found a way, once again, to circumvent the reduction program without openly defying Enlil's authority. The second program had failed. The third program is the most comprehensive and the most damaged in the surviving textual record. Drawing on the Sipar library tablets published by A.R. George and F.N.H. Al-Rawi in their 1996 analysis, scholars have reconstructed a third phase that involved a more systematic suppression of natural abundance. Multiple systems simultaneously withdrawn. A combined assault on the conditions that allowed human life to sustain itself. The implication is that Enlil had recognized, after 2 failed attempts, that his programs needed to be more comprehensive if they were to succeed. Individual instruments could be neutralized. A combined withdrawal of multiple life-sustaining systems might not be. But Enki intervened again. 3 attempts. 3 failures. 3 times the administrative apparatus of the divine governance of the earth was deployed to reduce the first version of humanity to acceptable levels, and 3 times a single member of the divine administration found a mechanism to defeat the attempt without technically violating the institutional framework within which he was operating. The pattern that these 3 failures establish is crucial for understanding what the flood was. The flood was not Enlil's first response to the noise problem. It was not the impulsive reaction of an offended deity. It was the final instrument in a sequence of escalating interventions, each one more comprehensive than the last, each one designed to foreclose the specific mechanism that had allowed the previous attempt to fail. 3 rounds of graduated management had produced 3 failures. The flood was the instrument that the failures made necessary, the one approach that could not be neutralized through the channels of divine human communication that had defeated every previous attempt. There was no plague deity in the flood to propitiate. There was no specific instrument to neutralize through targeted worship. The flood was total, water from above and water from below simultaneously, covering the entire surface of the earth in a way that left no mechanism of response available to even the most intelligent and well-connected member of the first version. Except one. The loophole in the oath, the reed wall. The words spoken to the reeds in a room where a man who was not supposed to be warned was present to hear them. There was a gathering. The divine assembly convened. The Ubshukina, the chamber of fates, the place where the great gods came together to make the decisions that the world would be required to live with. Enlil's proposal was on the table. 3 rounds of graduated reduction had failed. The noise of humanity had recovered from each suppression and risen again. The administrative problem was unresolved and, after 3 failed attempts, demonstrably resistant to the kind of targeted management that had been tried. The flood was proposed, total, simultaneous. The sky releasing its water and the Abzu, the deep freshwater realm beneath the earth, Enki's own domain, opening upward against the surface of the world. 7 days and 7 nights of combined deluge designed to leave nothing on the surface of the inhabited earth alive. Not a targeted instrument, not a specific deity deploying a specific affliction that could be neutralized through specific propitiation. An environmental reset. The surface of the earth returned to the condition of the primordial waters from which it had been separated at the beginning of creation. The divine assembly deliberated. We do not have a transcript of that deliberation. The tablets do not preserve the arguments made in the chamber of fates on the night the decision was reached. but the structure of the decision, specifically the mechanism required to make it binding, tells us something about what the deliberation contained. An oath was required, not a decree, not a vote whose results would be recorded and distributed through the channels of divine governance. A collective oath. Every god present in the assembly swearing individually and collectively that they would not warn humanity of the coming flood, that they would not communicate through any channel, direct speech, indirect advice. The Mies established mechanisms of divine human communication, any means available. The information that the flood was coming and that survival required preparation. The oath was specifically designed to foreclose the mechanism that had defeated the 3 previous programs. Each of those programs had been neutralized through Enki's counter-advice to Atrahasis. Specific information about how to respond to the specific instrument being deployed, delivered through the channels of divine human communication that the Mi had established. The oath was the mechanism for ensuring that this could not happen a 4th time. If every god in the assembly was bound by a sworn commitment not to warn humanity, then Enki, the specific member of the assembly who had been circumventing the reduction programs, was bound along with everyone else. The oath did not target Enki explicitly. It did not need to. It targeted the behavior that had defeated 3 consecutive programs. The mechanism that had protected the first version of humanity from 3 rounds of administrative reduction was the information advantage that Enki had given it. The oath removed that advantage. Think about who was in that room. Ninhursag was there. The mother goddess who had shaped the first humans with her hands, who had worked the clay mixed with Wei-Ilu's divine substance, who had placed the first 14 humans before the divine assembly and watched them deploy to the 5 cities where they would live for 241,000 years. She swore. The text records her subsequent grief during the flood. She had spoken evil in the divine assembly, which tells us that the oath was not taken with enthusiasm. It was taken, but not without cost. Enki was there, the designer of the Lulu, the engineer who had specified the cognitive capacity of the first version, the administrator who had intervened 3 times to protect what he had built from Enlil's reduction programs. He swore. He took the oath that bound him to silence. He committed, in the presence of the full divine assembly, to not warning the humans he had spent the entire pre-flood period protecting. And then he went to the house of Atrahasis. He sat beside the wall, the reed fence that formed the boundary between the interior of the house and the outside world. And he spoke his warning to the reeds. The words, as the Atrahasis epic preserves them, are among the most famous in all of ancient literature. Wall here, me. Reed fence, pay attention. Man of Shurapak, son of Ubaratutu. Tear down your house, build a boat. Abandon possessions, seek life. Spurn property, save life. Load into the boat the seed of all living creatures. The boat you build, let its dimensions be measured. Let its width and length be equal. Atrahasis heard every word. He was in the room. The wall was in the room. Enki was speaking to the wall. The technical distinction between speaking to a wall and speaking to the man on the other side of that wall is the distinction between honoring an oath and violating it. It is the thinnest possible distinction. It is a distinction that exists entirely in the formal structure of the commitment, rather than in any practical or moral reality. Enki warned Atrahasis. He warned him completely, specifically, with all the information Atrahasis needed to survive the flood. He honored his oath by not technically speaking to a human being while entirely defeating its purpose by ensuring that a Human being heard everything he said. This is not a divine act in the mythological sense, the thunderous intervention of a cosmic force operating beyond human institutional logic. This is the act of a person, a specific, recognizable kind of person. The kind who has been present in every institution in human history that has ever made a terrible decision. The person who cannot stop the decision, who is formally bound to comply with it, and who finds the minimum possible violation of formal compliance that allows them to do what they believe is right. Enki had taken an oath before the full assembly of the great gods of the Sumerian world. He honored that oath by speaking to a wall. He defeated it by ensuring the man who needed to hear was present for the speaking. The first version of humanity had been sentenced to death by a governing body that found it excessive. One member of that body, bound by a commitment he had formally accepted, found a mechanism for defeating it without technically violating it. And the survivor he chose, Atrahasis, Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, the figure who carries different names in different texts but always the same essential role, began to build. The flood was coming. The divine administration had made its decision. The first version of humanity was going to end. But not entirely, because one man had been in the room when the warning was delivered to the wall. And on that incompleteness, that single surviving thread of the first version carried forward on a boat through 7 days of water. Everything that came after would depend. The storm began. The Atrahasis epic describes the onset of the flood with language that is simultaneously mythological in its cosmic scope and strangely intimate in its specific details. The weather god Adad thundered through the clouds. The dike breakers went through the land, a specific technical term for the mechanisms that released stored water, implying that the flood's engineering was deliberate and precise. Above, the storm. Below, the Abzu opened, Enki's own domain, the deep freshwater reservoir beneath the earth, released upward against the surface of the world. The design was total. There was no ground to retreat to. There was no high place that the combined action of storm from above and rising water from below would leave dry. The surface of the earth that Enlil administered was being returned to the condition of the waters from which it had been separated. The world was being unmade in the precise sense, the organized, administered, inhabited surface of the earth dissolved back into the undifferentiated waters that had preceded it. The Atrahasis epic records what the gods did during the 7 days. They retreated to the heaven of Anu, the highest divine realm, above the storm, above the rising water, and they did not watch with composure. The text describes the gods crouching against the outer wall of Anu's heaven, huddled, small against the scale of what they had set in motion. Ninhursag wept. Her lamentation during the 7 days is one of the most direct emotional passages in the entire Atrahasis epic. She had spoken evil in the assembly. She had agreed to the flood. She had been in the room when the oath was taken, and she had taken the oath with everyone else. And now the flood she had agreed to was executing itself below her, on the surface of the world where the beings she had made with her hands were drowning. And the weight of that agreement was something she had not, apparently, fully understood until she was required to live with its consequences in real time. The Mother Goddess, the maker of humanity, weeping above the flood that was unmaking what she had made. Enlil, in the texts that describe the divine assembly's experience of the 7 days, does not watch with satisfaction. The mainstream scholarly treatment of this passage notes that even the flood's primary advocate found the scale of the destruction difficult to inhabit once it was actually occurring. The decision that had seemed like administrative necessity in the Chamber of Fates looked different when it was executing itself below the retreating gods on the wall of Anu's heaven. This detail, the gods retreating, crouching, weeping during the flood they had ordered, is not incidental. It is the Sumerian record's most direct statement about the moral texture of the erasure. The Anunnaki did not order the flood and then observe its execution with administrative detachment. They retreated from it. They huddled against the walls of heaven while the world below them drowned. Ninhursag wept openly. Even Enlil, the architect of the decision, does not appear in these passages as a being at ease with the outcome he has engineered. The flood was a decision that the divine assembly reached, executed, and then could not fully inhabit the moral reality of once it was underway. This is recognizable, not as mythology, as human institutional behavior. The decision made in the abstract, in the procedural formality of the assembly, that becomes something different when it is real, when it is executing itself in the world, when the beings affected by it are not administrative abstractions, but actual inhabitants of an actual surface that is being covered by actual water. On the boat, Atrahasis lived in the 7 days from the inside. The text does not record what he saw when he looked out at the waters. The tablets that would have contained this passage are among the most damaged sections of the Atrahasis epic's second tablet. What they preserve is his response after the storm subsided, the offerings he made, the prostration before Utu the sun god when the hatch was opened and the light returned. But not what he saw, not what it looked like from the deck of a boat on the 7th day when the storm withdrew and the water that had been the world was quiet. We sit with that silence. What was gone in that silence was the entirety of the first version's world, the 5 cities, the 8 dynasties, the Lulu in its original form, the beings who had been designed for labor and had grown into something that filled the earth with its presence and its noise. 241,000 years of accumulated existence, of building and planting and maintaining and multiplying and generating the rigmu that had disturbed the administrator of the earth's surface. Gone. Return to the water. Return to the condition of the formless deep that had preceded all of it. What Atrahasis had on the boat was everything he could carry: provisions, the seed of living creatures, his family, and in the clay of memory, in the chain of transmission that would eventually produce the tablets we are reading, the instructions of Shurapak, his father's words, the wisdom of the antediluvian world, the behavioral codes and practical guidance of a civilization that had existed for 241,000 years before the water came. He had the knowledge. He did not have the world the knowledge came from. On the 7th day, the storm subsided. The sea grew quiet. The wind withdrew. Atrahasis opened the hatch. The light came in, and the world that was gone was gone. The smell of the sacrifice reached heaven before the argument did. This is one of the most striking images in the entire Atrahasis epic. The gods who had retreated to the walls of Anu's heaven during the 7 days, who had huddled and wept and watched from a distance the execution of the decision they had made, drawn back to the surface of the transformed world by the smell of Atrahasis's post-flood offering. The text describes them gathering around the sacrifice like flies, an image so undignified so thoroughly unlike the majestic divine assembly of the Ubshukina that it has occupied scholars for generations. It is the image of beings who are hungry, not for food in the literal sense, but for the offerings that the relationship between humanity and the divine administration provided. The worship, the propitiation, the maintenance of the divine human channel that the Me had established. The gods who had just drowned their workforce were clustering around the first evidence that a remnant of that workforce had survived and was still capable of making offerings. The flood had accomplished its primary purpose. The surface of the earth had been reset. The first version of humanity, the 241,000 years of the antediluvian world, the 5 cities and the 8 dynasties, and the accumulated noise of the Lulu proliferating beyond its designed parameters, was gone. The Rigmu had been extinguished. The administrator of the Earth's surface could, in principle, sleep. But the flood had not accomplished its secondary purpose. Humanity was not extinct. Atrahasis was on the boat. His family was on the boat. The seed of living creatures was on the boat. And the smell of his sacrifice was rising to the walls of Anu's heaven, where the divine assembly had spent the last 7 days crouching in what the text implies was something close to shame. Enlil arrived at the scene and found the survivor. The Atrahasis epic records his fury plainly. He was enraged. The decision of the assembly had been implemented. The oath had been honored. Every god had refrained from warning humanity as the sworn commitment required. The flood had executed itself exactly as designed. And still a human being was standing on a boat in the middle of the receding waters, making offerings, alive. He knew, immediately, that the oath had been technically honored and practically defeated. He knew who had found the loophole. He confronted Enki. Enki's defense is a masterwork of institutional argumentation. He had not revealed the secret of the great gods. He had spoken to a wall. Whatever Atrahasis had heard was a consequence of the architecture of his dwelling, not of any communication from Enki to a human being. The letter of the oath had been honored in every particular. The fact that the letter and the spirit had diverged was Enki's implied argument runs, not his responsibility to resolve. Enlil was not satisfied, but Enlil was also a pragmatist. The flood had happened. The first version of humanity was gone. A remnant had survived. The question was not how to undo the survival. Atrahasis was alive. His family was alive. The seed of living creatures was on the boat. But what to do with the world that now existed? The post-flood world. The world that had to be rebuilt on the surface that the water had cleared. Enki seized this moment. He offered Enlil a solution to the problem that had made the flood necessary. Not another round of targeted reduction. Not another escalating management program that the intelligence of the surviving human population might eventually learn to neutralize. A structural solution, a redesign, the replacement version of humanity, the post-flood humans who would repopulate the cleared earth, would be built differently. Not radically differently. Not so differently that the continuity of the human project was broken, but differently enough that the specific failure mode of the first version would be structurally foreclosed. The first version had grown without limit. Its reproductive capacity, unconstrained, had produced the population levels that Enlil found intolerable. The replacement version would have built-in demographic controls. The Pasitu, the snatcher away of newborns, a category of mortality specifically affecting infants, present in the post-flood world as a structural feature of existence, not as the result of any specific divine deployment. some children would not survive. This would not be a reduction program initiated by the divine assembly in response to excessive population levels. It would be a permanent feature of the human condition, a ceiling on the population growth rate built into the design of the replacement version itself. The Naditu, the celibate temple women, a class of human beings removed from the reproductive cycle, dedicated to the divine house, living their lives outside the structure of family and reproduction that drove population growth. Not a punishment for any individual, a demographic control mechanism integrated into the social structure of the replacement version. A category of human existence that would permanently maintain a portion of the female population outside the reproductive system. The institutionalization of infant mortality, the celibate class. These were not imposed on the post-flood world as external interventions. They were designed into the post-flood world as features, permanent, structural, requiring no ongoing administrative action to maintain. The Atrahasis epic presents Enlil's acceptance of this proposal as the resolution of the post-flood negotiation. What Enki offered addressed the operational requirement that 3 rounds of graduated reduction and ultimately a catastrophic flood had failed to permanently resolve. A human population with built-in demographic constraints would not grow to the levels that had disturbed the administrator of the Earth's surface. The noise problem would be managed through the design of the replacement version rather than through periodic administrative interventions. Enlil accepted the settlement. The post-flood world was commissioned. The replacement version of humanity, the one that would inherit the cleared earth, rebuild the cities, establish the dynasties recorded in the post-flood section of the Sumerian king list, was going to be installed with specifications that the first version had not had. Shorter lives, built-in infertility for a structural portion of the population, infant mortality as a permanent feature of the human condition. The second version of humanity had been designed, and its design incorporated as permanent features the limits that the first version's unconstrained existence had failed to maintain. His name means life of long days. In some scholarly translations, it is rendered as he who found life of long days, a slight but significant variation, suggesting not simply a person characterized by longevity, but a person who discovered, who reached, who was granted the extraordinary duration that the name describes. Ziusudra, the last king of Shuruppak, the 5th and final antediluvian city, the son of Ubaratutu, the 8th and last name on the antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list. He was born at the end of the first version. His father's name is the last name before the 7 words. Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, the final antediluvian king, the last ruler in the extraordinary sequence of 8 dynasties across 241,000 years. His son, Ziusudra, was the last king of the last antediluvian city, the last individual to hold political authority in the world that the flood would erase. He stood at the terminus of the first version, the final point of a continuous sequence that stretched back to Alulim of Eridu, the first king, reigning 28,800 years at the very beginning of the antediluvian record. The Eridu Genesis describes Ziusudra as devoted, attentive, a servant of the divine house in the most faithful sense, performing daily acts of reverence, prostrating himself before the divine, standing by the sacred structures of his city with the consistency that the text implies was the quality that brought him to Enki's attention. He was not exceptional in the way that a hero is typically exceptional. Not a warrior, not a conqueror, not a figure of dramatic individual achievement. He was exceptional in his faithfulness to the ordinary duties of his position. Enki chose him deliberately. This cannot be overstated. The Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis together make clear that the preservation of Atrahasis Ziusudra was not accidental. It was not the fortunate coincidence of a capable individual being in the right place when the warning was delivered. Enki had spent the entire pre-flood period protecting the first version of humanity through targeted interventions. He understood the specific individual to whom each intervention needed to be directed. The choice of who would receive the reed wall warning was Enki's choice. Deliberate, considered, based on his assessment of who among the first version's population had the specific combination of intelligence, faithfulness, and relationship with the divine administration required to understand and act on the warning correctly. Enki chose the last king of the last antediluvian city, the son of the last king on the list, the man whose name means life of long days, the final representative of the antediluvian royal line, the continuous chain of divine-human administrative relationship that had run from the first descent of kingship at Eridu through 8 dynasties and 241,000 years to the last generation before the flood. Why this specific choice? The tablets do not explain it in the terms we are asking, but the structure of the choice implies something about what Enki was trying to preserve. He was not simply saving a human being. Any intelligent, faithful human being would have served the minimal purpose of maintaining human existence through the flood. He was saving a specific human being, the last king of the antediluvian world, the bearer of the longest royal lineage in the first version's history, the man who, more than any other living member of the first version, carried within his existence the continuous thread of the antediluvian order. What came out of the flood, through Enki's deliberate choice, was not a random survivor. It was the most direct possible link between the first version and whatever would come after it. And then Ziusudra was separated from what came after. The Eridu Genesis records the conclusion of his story with a brevity proportionate to its weight. After the flood, after the offerings, after the divine assembly gathered around the sacrifice, Anu and Enlil granted Ziusudra life like a god, eternal life. The life of the long days that his name had always promised, but that the post-flood settlement had specifically decided would not be a feature of the replacement version's existence. And they placed him in Dilmun, the eastern paradise, the land where the sun rises, the place at the edge of the world where the conditions of ordinary post-flood existence do not apply. Enki's own sacred territory in some textual traditions, the land of the Abzu's surface, the place where fresh water meets the world. He was not given a role in the post-flood world. He was not appointed to rule the new dynasties. He was not made a patriarch whose lineage would carry the first version's bloodline into the second world. He was preserved, and in being preserved, he was removed, placed outside the ordinary world that was being rebuilt on the cleared surface of the earth. The Gilgamesh epic, which preserves the flood story in its most complete Akkadian form, names the survivor Utnapishtim and records the same essential conclusion: immortality granted, relocation to the edges of the world, separation from the ordinary human community. Gilgamesh reaches Utnapishtim after a journey to the ends of the earth and finds him living beyond the waters of death, accessible only through extraordinary effort, entirely separated from the civilization that his survival had made possible. Why was Ziusudra Utnapishtim separated? The mainstream scholarly reading treats his relocation as a theological necessity. A being who has been elevated to near-divine status cannot continue to inhabit the ordinary human world. His immortality places him categorically outside the conditions of post-flood human existence. He belongs with the gods, or in the divine adjacent spaces at the margins of the world, rather than among the mortals who now populate the earth. This reading is well supported and consistent with how the Sumerian and Akkadian texts handle the elevation of human beings to divine or semi-divine status generally. But consider the structural logic of the separation in the context of everything the tablets have told us about the difference between the first version and the replacement. The post-flood settlement had specifically designed the replacement version with shorter lives. The Pasitu and the Naditu and the other demographic controls were features of the new design. Parameters built into the replacement version to prevent the first version's proliferation from recurring. The replacement version was explicitly not supposed to have the life of long days that characterized the antediluvian world. Ziusudra had the life of long days. That was the extraordinary duration his name embodied, and that Anu and Enlil explicitly granted him in the post-flood settlement. He was the last representative of the first version's biological character, the being who had lived within the antediluvian parameters, who embodied in his own existence the extraordinary duration that the king list recorded and that the post-flood settlement had specifically decided not to continue. Placing Ziusudra in Dilmun was not simply a theological reward for his faithfulness. It was a structural necessity for the integrity of the post-flood design. A being with the antediluvian lifespan, living among the post-flood population, would be incompatible with the parameters of the replacement version. His presence would be a living demonstration that the limits built into the post-flood design were not natural features of human existence. They were design decisions. If Ziusudra walked among the post-flood humans, growing no older while they aged and died, the designed constraints of the replacement version would be visible as constraints. The population that was supposed to accept shortened lives and demographic limits as the natural conditions of existence would have, in their midst, a man who embodied the proof that things had once been otherwise. He was given immortality. He was placed in Dilmun. He was kept apart. One copy of the original, preserved, maintained, held in a remote location beyond ordinary reach, while the replacement version was installed in the world that the flood had cleared. The instructions of Shuruppak, the wisdom of the antediluvian world, the practical guidance of a civilization that had existed for 241,000 years, crossed the boundary of the flood in the form of transmitted knowledge. The words survived. The man who embodied the first version's nature did not return with them. He remained in Dilmun, preserved, sequestered. The last of the first version held apart from the second, in the land where the sun rises, at the edge of the world. His knowledge survived. His form did not continue. The first version ended with him. Not in death, Ziusudra did not die, but in the specific, carefully managed, architecturally precise separation of the last representative of the first version from the world the second version would inhabit. The replacement was installed. The original was archived, and the world moved forward into the post-flood era, shorter-lived, more numerous in its centers of authority, more contested and fragmented and loud, carrying in its scribal tradition the memory of what had preceded it, copied faithfully from generation to generation by people who understood their role as preservation rather than composition. keeping something alive that had almost not made it through. Assemble the inventory of the absence, not as an abstraction, as a specific list of what the flood erased and the post-flood settlement chose not to restore. The extraordinary duration, the antediluvian lifespan, whatever its nature, whatever its biological or administrative basis, whether it was literal or symbolic or some combination of both, did not survive the transition. The post-flood king list shows kings reigning for hundreds of years, then decades, then the historically attested measurements of years and months. The compression is structural. Whatever allowed the first version's kings to reign for tens of thousands of years was not carried forward. It was not incapable of being carried forward. Ziusudra received it as a specific grant in the post-flood settlement, a deliberate extension of the antediluvian condition to one individual. It was available. It was withheld from everyone else. The long life of the first version was not lost because it was impossible to maintain. It was discontinued because its continuation in a general population would have reproduced the conditions that had made the first version intolerable. The administrative stability. 8 kings in 5 cities for 241,000 years versus dozens of competing dynasties in dozens of competing cities within the first few post-flood centuries. The stability of the first version was structural. It came from above, from the direct administrative oversight of the Anunnaki operating through the antediluvian royal lines. The post-flood world replaced this with shorter-lived, more numerous, more contested royal lines, maintaining less direct relationships with the divine administration. The post-flood world was noisier from its very first generations, more fragmented, more competitive, more dynamic, more human in the sense that we use the word, meaning more characterized by the contingency and change and competition that we understand as the defining features of historical existence. The first version did not have history in this sense. It had administration, the same structure, maintained from above, for an incomprehensible duration. The second version was released into something more like what we call time, a flow of events in which change is possible, competition is real, and no single administrative structure maintains itself across durations that exceed human reckoning. Whether this release into time was a gift or a diminishment is a question the tablets do not answer. They record the change. They do not evaluate it, the direct relationship with the divine administration. The antediluvian kings were interfaces, direct, continuous, maintained points of contact between the human population and the Anunnaki. The post-flood kings were something more like representatives, appointed, yes, through the divine descent of kingship that the Eridu Genesis describes as being re-established after the flood, but operating at a greater remove from the administrative beings above them. The me that governed the post-flood world were inherited structures rather than current directives. The divine administration was present in the architecture of civilization rather than in the continuous direct relationship the antediluvian kings embodied. The knowledge that Shurapak could not fully transmit. The instructions of Shurapak contain behavioral wisdom, how to live within a structured society, how to navigate legal disputes and relationships with authority, and the practical requirements of daily existence within a complex civilization. What they cannot contain, what no text the antediluvian world produced, if it produced texts at all, appears to have preserved, is the full scope of what it meant to exist within the first version's parameters. What the antediluvian lifespan felt like from the inside. What the direct administrative relationship with the Anunnaki involved in practice. what the first version knew about its own nature, its relationship to the beings who had made it, the conditions of its designed existence. That knowledge, if it was ever articulated, if the first version had language and record sufficient to articulate it, is on the missing third of CBS 10,673, or deeper in the earth at Nippur, or in Dilmun with Ziusudra, preserved in the memory of the last man who lived it, unavailable to the world that came after, because the man who carried it was placed beyond the reach of that world by the same settlement that redesigned it. What was lost was not simply a version of humanity. What was lost was a mode of existence, a way of being human that was slower, longer, more directly administered, and apparently more stable than anything the second version has ever achieved. Whether it was better is not a question the tablets ask. Whether it was human in any sense we would recognize is a question they cannot answer. What they record is that it was different, and that the difference was deliberately ended, and that the ending was followed by the careful, faithful, 1,000-year preservation of everything that could be preserved of the memory of what had been lost. The post-flood settlement's design parameters, as the Atrahasis epic records them: shorter lives. The dramatic compression of the king list's reign durations after the flood is not simply a feature of the historical record becoming more accurate as it approaches attested history. It reflects a genuine change in the conditions of existence. The post-flood human lives less long. This was not an accident of nature, a biological consequence of the flood's disruption of the pre-flood environment, a random genetic drift in the surviving population. According to the tablets, it was a design decision, a feature of the replacement version selected in the post-flood negotiation and implemented as a permanent parameter of the new human condition. We do not know the mechanism. The tablets describe the outcome, not the biology. But within the world of the texts, the shortened post-flood lifespan was chosen. It was one of the specifications of the replacement version. The first version had lived long enough to accumulate the population levels that generated the rigmu. The second version would be prevented from reaching those levels by living less long, by having less time in each individual life to contribute to the accumulated noise that the administrator of the Earth's surface could not tolerate. Built-in infertility. The Naditu class, women who would not bear children. Institutionalized as a category within the social structure of the post-flood world. These were not simply women who chose not to have children, or who were biologically incapable of reproduction by individual variation. They were a recognized social category, dedicated to the temple, their celibacy understood as a divine assignment rather than a personal circumstance. The social structure of the post-flood world had a place for them, a role, a function, a status, that was specifically organized around their removal from the reproductive cycle. This is not a natural feature of human social organization. Every human culture that has existed has had individuals who did not reproduce for various reasons. But the institutionalization of a celibate class as a formal social category, with its own designated role, its own relationship to the divine administration, its own recognized place in the structure of civilization, is a deliberate design feature. The post-flood social structure was built with a compartment specifically for the non-reproductive. The compartment was part of the design. Infant mortality, the pasitu, the one who snatches away the newborn, present in the post-flood world as a structural feature of existence. Some children would not survive. This reality, which every human culture has faced and mourned across all of recorded history, is described in the Atrahasis epic not as the natural consequence of the biological fragility of newborns, though it is that too, but as a deliberately installed parameter. A permanent ceiling on population growth built into the design of the replacement version at the level of individual infant survival. The combined effect of these three parameters on a human population is demographic. A population whose individuals live shorter lives, a portion of whose women do not reproduce, and some percentage of whose newborns do not survive, is a population with a built-in ceiling on its growth rate. Not an absolute ceiling. The post-flood world's population grew throughout the Sumerian period and continues to grow in our own time in ways that would presumably have disturbed Enlil considerably. But a structural ceiling, a set of constraints that slow and limit the kind of unchecked proliferation that the first version had achieved. Sit with this inventory. These are the conditions of human life as we experience them. People die. The lifespans available to us are a fraction of what the king list records for the antediluvian kings. Some people cannot have children. Some infants do not survive. We understand these as natural features of biological existence, the inevitable costs of organic life in a physical world, the mortality that defines the human condition, the grief that comes with loss and limitation. The Atrahasis epic does not describe them as natural. It describes them as installed, deliberate features of a redesigned version, chosen in a post-catastrophe negotiation between two beings who disagreed about how much humanity was too much, and who reached a compromise whose terms we are still living inside. We cannot verify this. We cannot step outside our own design specifications to compare them with the first versions. We do not have access to the divine assembly's deliberations in any form beyond the cuneiform record that preserves them. We cannot know whether the Sumerian scribes were recording a memory of something that actually happened to humanity or constructing a theological explanation for conditions they observed around them. Both possibilities are real, neither can be closed. What we can say is that the Sumerians recorded the installation. And knowing that it was recorded, knowing that the oldest written civilization in human history preserved in their most carefully maintained texts a description of the conditions of human existence as design features rather than natural facts, changes, or at least should change, how we hold the question. This script has presented evidence, real tablets, real catalog numbers, real scholars, real translations. The patterns across the evidence are consistent and specific enough to be taken seriously. But evidence is not conclusion, and the script owes you a clear accounting of what the evidence can and cannot support. There are three ways to hear what the Sumerian records say about the first version of humanity and its erasure. Each is present in the scholarly literature. Each has strengths and limitations. None can be definitively confirmed or dismissed with the evidence currently available. The first is the mythological symbolic interpretation. This is the mainstream of modern academic scholarship, and it is the interpretation most thoroughly supported by the evidence. On this reading, the Sumerian creation and flood texts are literary constructions, sophisticated, theologically rich, culturally significant, but not records of actual events. The pre-flood world of the king list, with its extraordinary reign lengths, is a symbolic golden age, a narrative device for marking the transition from mythological time to historical time. The Atrahasis epic's three pre-flood plagues are narrative escalations building toward the climactic flood. The redesign of post-flood humanity is an etiological story explaining why human beings are mortal, why some cannot bear children, why the world has the structure it has. The me are theological constructs representing divine authority over all aspects of existence. Within this reading, scholars, including Jacobson, Kramer, Lambert, Millard, and Stephanie Daly, whose myths from Mesopotamia provides the most accessible scholarly compendium of these texts, have produced deeply nuanced analyses of what the Sumerian records reveal about ancient Mesopotamian religion, cosmology, and social organization. The symbolic reading does not diminish these texts. It honors them as works of theological and philosophical sophistication that shaped human thought for millennia. The second is the encoded wisdom interpretation. On this reading, the Sumerian creation and flood texts encode practical and philosophical knowledge in mythological form, not because the writers were unsophisticated, but because mythological encoding was the most durable and transmissible format available. The pre-flood king's extraordinary reign lengths may encode astronomical cycles. The Sar itself, 3,600, is a number with significant astronomical properties. The plagues before the flood may encode a record of climate events and their social consequences. The me may encode a systematic categorization of the functions required for civilized society, preserved in a form that ensured their transmission even through catastrophic social disruption. This reading treats the Sumerian records as a highly compressed archival system, dense with information, formatted for durability and transmission rather than for transparent presentation. The scribal tradition of faithful copying within this framework was not merely religious conservatism. It was the maintenance of an information system whose full meaning may not have been accessible even to the scribes themselves. The third is the historical documentary interpretation, the most speculative, the most difficult to evaluate with current evidence, and the one this script has been exploring most directly. On this reading, the Sumerian records preserve in mythological framing an actual memory of events, a memory of a version of humanity that existed before a major catastrophic event that was structurally and biologically different from the post-event population in ways the texts attempt to describe, and that was ended by a combination of deliberate intervention and natural catastrophe. The pre-flood king's long reign durations on this reading may reflect literal lifespans of a biological type no longer represented in the post-flood population. The 3 pre-flood plagues may reflect actual demographic interventions. The flood may have been a real event or series of events. The archaeological evidence for flood layers at various Mesopotamian sites at various dates supports the historical reality of major inundations that coincided with or caused a significant discontinuity in human population. The strongest objection to the third reading is that we have no independent evidence, biological, genetic, or archaeological, for a type of human being that lived for tens of thousands of years. The Sumerian records themselves may be offering us the only evidence, and using the Sumerian records to validate the Sumerian records is a circular methodology. The second objection is that the mythological symbolic reading accounts for everything the texts contain without requiring the postulation of otherwise unattested phenomena. It is the more parsimonious interpretation. The strongest argument for taking the third reading seriously, not as certain but as worth holding open, is the administrative specificity of the Sumerian records. These were not storytellers. They were scribes. They recorded grain inventories with the same meticulous care they applied to flood narratives. When they preserved the antediluvian king list in the same administrative format as the historically attested post-flood king list, they were making a statement about the nature of the record, even if we cannot be certain what that statement meant to them. All three readings agree on the fundamental structure of what the tablets say. Before the flood, something different existed. After the flood, it was gone. What came after was shaped by the transition, and the memory of what came before was preserved, partially, imperfectly, but deliberately, by a tradition that understood its role as the maintenance of something received rather than the composition of something new. All three readings agree on the erasure. They disagree only on what was erased and what the erasure means. You have heard the evidence. All three readings are available to you. The tablets do not choose. They simply record. The choice of how to read them is yours, and the Sumerian scribes, who understood themselves as preservers rather than interpreters, would probably have considered that the appropriate distribution of responsibility. Return to the beginning. The feeling that opened this script, the sensation of arriving somewhere and knowing that something important happened here before you came. The specific texture of standing at the edge of an erasure, the silence that has the shape of the sound that preceded it. You have now heard what the Sumerian records say that something was. A version of humanity that lived for extraordinary durations in a world of 5 cities and 8 dynasties and near-perfect administrative stability. Created for labor, canal digging, irrigation maintenance, the infrastructure of the divine household. Given just enough intelligence to perform that labor, and discovering that just enough intelligence to maintain a civilization is also enough to proliferate beyond any threshold designed for it. Subjected to 3 rounds of graduated demographic management by the administration that created it. Finally erased by a flood that one member of that administration found a way to make incomplete. The survivor of that version lives in Dilmun still in the Sumerian imagination, immortal, separated. The last copy of the original, preserved in the land where the sun rises, beyond the reach of the world, his survival helped continue. The replacement, the second version, the one installed in the cleared world after the flood, received different specifications, shorter lives, built-in demographic constraints, the conditions of existence that we experience as the natural facts of biological life. Return to CBS 10673 in Philadelphia. The missing third. What is on those fragments we do not know. What the antediluvian scribes, if there were any, recorded about the world before Nippur, we do not know. What Ziusudra knows in Dilmun that he cannot send back, we do not know. The record is partial. The tablet is broken. The thing it was trying to preserve is itself only partially preserved. The outline without the interior, the administrative record without the lived experience, the numbers without the duration they were supposed to represent. But the question the record was always building toward can be stated now. Not, did the Anunnaki exist? Not, was the flood real? Not, should we believe the Sumerian creation texts as literal history? Those questions are real and worth asking, and this script has tried to honor their complexity rather than collapse it. The question that the tablets keep open, by their very incompleteness, by the fact that they gesture toward a world they can only partially describe, a world from which they are themselves separated by the boundary the Sumerian scribes marked with 7 words, is this: who were we before? Not who were the Sumerians, not who were the antediluvian kings. Who were we, the species, the form, the thing that was designed and deployed and found to be excessive and redesigned and is now lying in the dark, listening to a recording about itself? What would it mean to be the second version? What would it mean to carry, in the design of your lifespan, in the parameters of your reproduction, in the conditions of your existence. The specifications of a post-catastrophe settlement, negotiated between beings who disagreed about how much of you was too much. What would it mean if the mortality you experience as the natural horizon of existence was chosen? If the limits of your body are not the default state of what you could be, but the revised state of what you were permitted to be after the first state proved excessive? We do not answer this. The Sumerians did not answer it either. They wrote it down and copied it and preserved it across millennia and buried it in the earth at Nippur and waited 5,000 years. The wonder is not in the answer. The wonder is in the question's age. It was pressed into wet clay by hands that believed they were recording something true. It survived every civilization that rose and fell above the buried earth of southern Iraq. It survived the excavators who lifted it from the ground in the last decade of the 19th century without fully understanding what they had found. It was translated by scholars who spent their careers in its presence and who preserved, in their careful technical work, something they may not have fully understood was also about them, about us. It waited in the dark, patient as clay, quiet as the bottom of a river, for someone to come and lift it into the light. And now you have heard it, in the dark, wherever you are in the world tonight. The first version of humanity may or may not have existed. The Anunnaki may or may not have been the beings the Sumerians believed they were. The flood may or may not have been the administrative reset that the oldest written records in human history describe it as. But the memory was preserved, deliberately, faithfully, across 5,000 years, by people who understood that some things are too important to lose, even when the world that contained them has been washed away. They kept it for us. The question is ours now. Sleep well. The clay has waited 5,000 years. It can wait until morning.